Hey friends! Glad you're here at No Harry, we've cooked up something special. What if Tony Stark hacked Gringotts at Harry's age 10 and discovered Dumbledore embezzled 2 million galleons? Liking and subscribing really helps us out. Okay, story time. Chapter 1, Static. The explosion wasn't Tony's fault. Well, it was mostly not Tony's fault. The part where he rewired his father's interdimensional resonance prototype to run at twice its rated capacity, that part might technically be considered his fault. But the part where Howard Stark left said prototype unsecured in his private lab with a sticky note that said do not touch rather than, say, an actual lock, that was clearly a parenting failure, and Tony felt strongly that the blame should be distributed accordingly. He'd been trying to fix it, if anyone cared about that detail. Which nobody would, because the lab was currently a smoking crater and Tony was not in it anymore. He was somewhere else entirely. The somewhere else smelled like candle wax, animal fur, and something sweet and alcoholic that reminded him of the bottle Howard kept behind the good scotch. Tony sat up from the cobblestones, actual cobblestones, who had cobblestones in 1990, and pressed his hand against the back of his skull where it had connected with the ground. His palm came away clean. No blood. Good. His head hurt like he'd been hit by a truck, but his skull was intact, which meant his brain was intact, which was the only part of his body that genuinely mattered. He looked around. It was an alley. Narrow, crooked, built like someone had stacked the buildings on both sides while drunk and then forgotten to make them straight. Every shop front was crammed against the next with no logic to the spacing. A place selling cauldrons sat next to what appeared to be an apothecary, which sat next to a shop with live owls in the window, which sat next to a store whose sign read Flourish and Blots and whose display case contained books that were, without question, moving. Tony stared at the moving books. One of them waved at him. He stared harder. The book waved again, its cover flapping like a hand, the golden title on its spine glinting in the light of torches. He registered. Actual torches. In brass brackets on actual stone walls. In what appeared to be a fully inhabited shopping district. Okay, Tony said aloud, to no one. Okay. That's new. The street was busy. Busy in a way that made zero sense by any metric he had access to. People in robes, actual, floor-length, medieval-looking robes, moved in and out of shops, carrying paper bags and wicker baskets and occasionally struggling with cages full of some kind of creature Tony had no biological classification for. A woman in bright purple robes walked past him without sparing him a glance, a stack of books floating in the air behind her like obedient ducks. A man in green paused at a shop window, jabbed something that looked like a stick at the display, and the display rearranged itself. Nobody seemed to find any of this unusual. Tony had, in his 10 years on Earth, catalogued the following as the upper boundary of unusual: his father's arc reactor prototype, the electromagnetic rail system he'd built at age 7 out of household appliances, and the time he'd accidentally made his bedroom TV receive signals from a Soviet military satellite. He had been very confident that this catalogue was comprehensive. He was revising his position. He stood up, brushed grit off his jeans, which were, he noted, making him deeply conspicuous in a sea of robes, and did the only logical thing. He started walking and cataloging everything he saw. The alley wasn't one alley. It was a network. Side streets branched off the main one like capillaries, each with its own cluster of strange shops and strange people doing strange things with what he was increasingly certain were magic wands. He watched a boy about his age flick one at a knot in his shoelace and the knot untied itself. He watched an elderly woman point one at a stack of boxes and the boxes levitated neatly onto a cart. He watched a man in a horrible mustard yellow cloak somehow manage to get his wand stuck in his own hat and spend 3 minutes swearing colorfully while people walked around him. Magic. They were doing magic. Tony's brain filed this under anomalous data requiring extensive analysis and also under incredibly cool, actually, which were two filing systems that did not usually overlap but were doing so right now with tremendous enthusiasm. He had been in this place, He was operating on the working hypothesis that he'd been thrown by the resonance prototype into some alternate dimension or possibly a highly isolated geographic pocket that had maintained medieval tech levels, and he was holding both options with equal probability, for approximately 14 minutes before someone noticed him. "You there, boy?" Tony turned around. A man in deep burgundy robes was looking at him with the specific expression adults reserve for things that were out of place and therefore inconvenient. He had a thin mustache, ink-stained fingers, and a clipboard, which suggested some kind of official function. "Yes," Tony said pleasantly. "Are you lost?" The man's eyes traveled down Tony's jeans and back up to his face with barely concealed distaste. "Muggle clothing," he said, as though this was a diagnosis. "Muggle," Tony repeated. "That's a word here." The man's eyebrows rose. "You're not, you haven't had your letter yet, have you? How old are you? You look a bit young for Diagon Alley on your own." "I'm 10, Tony said. "And I'm not lost, I'm exploring." He paused. "What's a Muggle?" The clipboard man pinched the bridge of his nose in the way adults did when a child was creating a problem they hadn't anticipated. "Non-magical," he said. "People without magic." "Where are your parents?" "New York," Tony said, which was technically accurate though not especially helpful, and he watched the man parse this information and arrive at the wrong conclusion, which was that Tony was a lost Muggle-born child who had somehow wandered into Diagon Alley. This was close enough to the truth. He was certainly lost, and he certainly had no magic, that Tony decided not to correct him. The man's name was Aldus Pembridge. He was a Ministry of Magic liaison for Muggle-born outreach, and Tony had him talking within 4 minutes. It took Tony about 11 minutes total. More actions request aborted. Write the next chapter now. Chapter 2, The Ledger. The goblin's name was Ironhook, and he had been working at Gringotts for 114 years. In those 114 years, he had processed 17,412 vault transactions. He had overseen the installation of 3 new Dragon security systems. He had personally designed the enchantment architecture on the lower vaults, the ones that made grown wizards weep and lose their sense of direction and occasionally forget their own names. He had caught 11 attempted robberies, foiled 4 inside jobs, and once, in a particularly satisfying afternoon, exposed a ministry official who had been trying to siphon Galleons through a fake inheritance claim. He had never, in 114 years, been hacked by a child. He was currently looking at the child. The child was sitting in the iron chair across from his desk, the chair that was specifically designed to be uncomfortable, with armrests that were just slightly too high and a seat angled just slightly too far forward, the chair that made fully grown adult wizards shift and squirm and lean too far forward with their necks exposed, which was psychologically intentional, and the child had his arms crossed, his feet swinging because they didn't reach the floor, and an expression of completely unself-conscious interest in the carvings on Ironhook's ceiling. "The knot work on those support beams," the child said, without looking down. "Is that structural or decorative?" "Both," Ironhook said, before he could stop himself. The child, Anthony Stark, the ministry liaison had called him, Muggle-born, no formal wizarding family, found wandering Diagon Alley, finally looked down from the ceiling. He had dark eyes that moved very quickly and a cut on his chin that was already drying and a Muggle device in his lap that Ironhook's security team had attempted to confiscate 3 times and been unable to, not because of any magical protection, but because every time they reached for it the boy moved it with the automatic reflex of someone who'd been protecting this particular object from grabbing hands his entire life. "You know why I'm here," Tony said. "I have a theory," Ironhook said. "Your theory is that I broke into your system." Tony's feet kept swinging. "Which I did. Partially. I didn't actually get into anything I shouldn't have gotten into, if that helps. I was in the public ledger architecture for about 6 minutes before your wards flagged me." 7 minutes and 43 seconds. 7:43, Tony agreed, like this was a perfectly normal thing to negotiate. "Your response time was good, by the way. Better than I expected. The flagging protocol on the 3rd access tier is actually really elegant. Whoever designed the layering on that, the way it mirrors the intrusion signature back at you without triggering until the third attempt, that's genuinely clever work. Ironhook looked at him for a long moment. In 114 years, he had also interviewed 11 intruders. Every single one of them had, at this point in the conversation, been either begging or threatening. This was the first one who had opened with architectural compliments. "You are 10 years old," Ironhook said. "Yes. And you bypassed the third access tier of the Gringotts public ledger with," Ironhook glanced at the report his security team had handed him, "a Muggle computational device and what our analysts are describing as, an extremely unusual approach to signal architecture that should not have been compatible with goblin enchantment systems under any known theoretical framework. Your enchantment systems run on intent-responsive magical current," Tony said, like this was obvious. "My device runs on electromagnetic signal. They're different carrier waves but the underlying logic structures are, look, you can argue about whether magic and electricity are different things at the base level, or you can notice that both of them follow consistent rules, and once you map the rules the interfaces aren't that different. It took me about 40 minutes. Ironhook set down the report very carefully. 40 minutes, he said. "I was also eating a pasty at the time," Tony said. "That woman on the street with the cart, the one near the entrance to the alley, her beef pasties are excellent, you should pass that along to whoever handles staff catering." He tilted his head. "Do goblins eat pasties?" "What did you find?" Ironhook said, "in the ledger?" The swinging feet stopped. Tony looked at him with those fast, dark eyes, and for the first time since he'd been brought into this office, his expression shifted into something that wasn't cheerful or curious or casually performative. It went very still and very focused, the way a lens goes when it locks onto something worth examining. "You already know," Tony said. "Your security team found my access logs. You know exactly which nodes I hit and in what order." He paused. "You're asking me to tell you what I made of it. Because you want to know how much I understand." Ironhook said nothing. "Smart," Tony said. "Okay. Fine." He uncrossed his arms and opened the device on his lap, a flat, dark rectangle that lit up at his touch, which made the two goblin guards flanking the door reach for their weapons until Ironhook held up a hand. "I found what looks like a routing irregularity in the trust account management architecture. Specifically, in the section that handles long-term custodial trusts for accounts where the primary holder is a minor and the trustee is listed as, wait." He tapped the screen twice. "Here. Trustee account designation, Dumbledore, Albus PWB cross-referenced against Potter, Harry J., minor, primary account holder." He looked up. "The discrepancy across the last 9 years, running quarterly, is approximately 2 million galleons." The room was very quiet. One of the guards by the door shifted his weight. The other one was very carefully not looking at Ironhook. Ironhook folded his long fingers together on his desk. "You understand," he said slowly, "that making accusations against—" "I'm not making accusations," Tony said. "I'm reading numbers. Numbers don't care who they're about." He turned the device screen to face Ironhook. "Look. You see this? This is your own ledger. I'm not showing you something I fabricated, I'm showing you a pattern in your own data that your own system contains. Every quarter, starting in November of 1981, a transfer of between 40,000 and 80,000 galleons routes from the Potter Estate Trust through what's coded as a Guardian Administrative Expense account." He tapped the screen. "The account the Guardian expense flows into is held under a name that's been redacted in the public tier. But the account number isn't redacted. And account numbers, I found, cross-reference against the trustee designation records, which are stored in a different part of the architecture with different security, which means whoever set up this routing assumed nobody would ever cross-reference the two tiers because they're structurally separated." He looked up. "They're structurally separated," Tony said, "but they're not logically separated. Same underlying current. I just asked the right question." Ironhook was quiet for a long time. Outside, Somewhere in the marble halls of Gringotts, he could hear the distant clatter of trolley wheels on stone, the murmur of transaction windows, the ordinary machinery of the most powerful bank in the wizarding world going about its entirely ordinary Wednesday. 40 tellers processing deposits. 17 vault runners navigating the subterranean rail network. 200 years of institutional reputation conducting business as usual. Ironhook reached under his desk and pressed a button that had never been pressed in his tenure. It summoned Sharp Fong. Sharp Fong was the head of Gringotts' internal security, which was a title that in the goblin understanding meant something considerably broader and more dangerous than the equivalent human concept. She arrived in 90 seconds, which meant she'd been close, which meant the security team had already escalated before Ironhook called, and she was tall for a goblin, sharp-faced and sharp-eyed, wearing robes the color of old iron, and she looked at Tony the way a person looks at a locked box they're not sure whether to open or bury. "This is the child," she said. "This is the child," Ironhook confirmed. Sharp Fong walked around the desk and stood next to Ironhook and looked at the device Tony was holding. She didn't reach for it. She just looked at the screen and read in silence for a moment. Then she said, "How old is the primary account holder?" 11, I think, Tony said. "Turned 11 this July based on the birth date in the trust designation." "And where is he?" "I don't know. The trust account has a guardian of record, but it's not Dumbledore, it's listed as a Muggle family." "Dursley. There's an address." Tony paused. "I wrote it down." Sharp Fong looked at Ironhook. Ironhook looked at Sharp Fong. Something passed between them that Tony couldn't fully read, but he could read the shape of it, the specific quality of silence between two people who have just confirmed, through a third party, something they already suspected and had been unable to act on. "You suspected," Tony said. "Not an accusation. Just reading the room." "Gringotts does not speculate," Ironhook said, which was not exactly a denial. "Right." Tony looked at the ceiling again briefly, thinking. "Okay, so, here's the thing. I'm in a weird position here, legally speaking. I'm not from your world. I don't know your laws. I don't know what this," he gestured at the screen, "is worth in terms of how your legal system processes financial crimes, and I don't know who has jurisdiction over what, and I especially don't know how deep the political protection goes for someone at Dumbledore's level." He looked back at them. "But I know how to build a case. And I know that the foundation of a good case is documentation that can't be argued with." He held up the device. "I have a copy of everything I pulled. But your system has the original." "The original cannot be altered retroactively," Sharp Fong said, and there was something in her voice that was almost satisfaction. "Goblin records are immutable once written. It is the foundation of our institution." "Great," Tony said. "So the data exists. The question is whether anyone with standing to act on it is willing to." Another silence. "You broke into our system," Ironhook said. 40 minutes, beef pasty, no damage to any actual vault, Tony said. "And I'm sitting here telling you what I found instead of walking out with it. Which I could have done." He met Ironhook's eyes. "I want to be clear that I could have done that." "I am aware," Ironhook said drily. "So." Tony closed the device and set it on his knee, his hands flat on top of it. "What I want is information. A way to understand your legal system well enough to figure out what to do with what I found. Access to your law library, you have one, the architecture nodes I passed through referenced a restricted legal archive. And I want to know if Harry Potter has ever accessed his own vault." Sharpfang's expression shifted microscopically. "He has not," she said. "Has he been informed it exists?" Silence. "Right," Tony said. "Okay. So we have a kid who doesn't know he has money, a trustee who's been taking that money for 9 years, a banking institution that technically has the records but no mechanism to act on them without a triggering complaint, and a legal system that," he stopped. "How do I file a complaint?" "In your system. Formally. Any account holder," Ironhook said, or their designated representative, may file a discrepancy claim against a custodial trust. Can a non-account holder file on behalf of a minor who doesn't know the account exists? With documented evidence of financial harm and proof of, I have documented evidence, Tony said. You are 10 years old and you are not a wizard and you are not from this world, Ironhook said. All of that is true, Tony agreed. None of it answers my question. The silence this time had a different texture. Ironhook and Sharp Fong were doing the thing again, the conversation in no words that Tony recognized from watching the Stark Industries board meetings his father occasionally dragged him to, the ones where adults had entire arguments with just their eyebrows while technically discussing quarterly projections. Sharp Fong made a decision. Tony could see it happen. Her chin moved 1 millimeter. Gringotts, Ironhook said carefully, does not require a complainant to be a wizard. It requires a complainant to have standing. Standing, in goblin law, is established by demonstrating direct knowledge of financial harm to a named account holder. He paused. You have demonstrated direct knowledge. Then I have standing, Tony said. You would also need to be willing to remain in this country and available for what could be a lengthy process. I don't currently have a way home, Tony said, with remarkable equanimity for someone making this admission for the first time. So that's not a problem. Ironhook studied him. This child who had appeared in Diagon Alley from nowhere, hacked the third tier of the most secure financial system in the wizarding world before lunchtime, eaten a beef pasty, and was now calmly proposing to file a legal complaint against the most powerful wizard alive using goblin banking law. Why? Ironhook asked. Not as a challenge. As a genuine question. You don't know this boy. Potter. You don't know this world. You have no stake in it. Tony was quiet for a moment, which was notable because he had not been quiet for more than about 30 seconds at any point since his arrival. I know what it looks like, Tony said finally, when a kid's money gets managed by someone who thinks they know better than the kid what the kid needs. His voice was perfectly even. I know what it looks like when the adults in charge convince themselves that taking what isn't theirs is actually fine because they're the ones with the vision and the plan and the greater good or whatever they call it. He looked directly at Ironhook. I know what that looks like from the inside. And I think it's garbage. He picked up the device again. So. Where's your law library? It took Sharp Fong 3 seconds to answer, which Tony was already learning meant something significant in goblin terms. Follow me, she said. The Gringotts Law Library was not, technically, accessible to non-goblins. This was not a rule that had ever needed to be formally written down, in the same way that you didn't formally write down that the lower vaults were not accessible to humans. It was simply a fact enforced by architecture and tradition and the general understanding that humans did not, as a rule, find their way into the parts of Gringotts that weren't the marble lobby. Sharp Fong took Tony through 3 doors that required her personal authentication, down a corridor lit with blue-white flame that moved when they moved, and into a room that was not as large as Tony had expected but was considerably more organized. The shelves were floor to ceiling and the books on them were, unlike the ones in Flourish and Blots, entirely still, dense, serious volumes in dark leather with titles pressed in silver. You can read? Sharp Fong asked. English and 3 other languages, Tony said. Will that be sufficient? The primary legal texts are in English with goblin notation in the margins. She pulled one from the shelf, Custodial Trust Law and Fiduciary Obligation in the Wizarding Estate System, 3rd edition, and handed it to him. It weighed about 4 pounds. The notation is largely self-explanatory if you approach it logically. I approach everything logically. Said Sharp Fong, in the tone of someone reserving judgment. She left him there with a stack of books, a lamp, and a small tray that appeared. He hadn't asked for this and nobody had explained it, bearing a cup of something hot and dark that was not quite tea and a second beef pasty. Tony opened the first book and started reading. He read for 4 hours without stopping. The goblin legal system was, he decided, genuinely impressive in its internal consistency. It didn't have the sprawling common law structure of English legal tradition or the codified rigidity of civil law systems. It was built on something older and more mathematical, a framework of obligation and exchange where every financial relationship was defined in terms of what was owed, by whom, to whom, and what the consequence of violation was. There was no ambiguity about intent. There was no concept of innocent mistake when it came to money. If you managed someone else's funds and the funds were mismanaged, it didn't matter whether you meant to mismanage them. The mismanagement was the fact, and the fact was what mattered. Tony found this philosophy deeply sensible. He also found, in the 7th chapter of the 3rd volume he'd pulled, Remediation Procedures for Trust Violations Involving Minor Account Holders, that Goblin law allowed for what was called a kashtarik, which translated roughly as a forced accounting, a legal action in which the bank itself could compel a trustee to appear before a goblin tribunal and account for every galleon of a minor's estate, triggered by a formal discrepancy claim with documented evidence. The kashtarik was invoked approximately once per century. But it had never, as far as Tony could find, been successfully defended against when the documentation was clean. He was on his 6th cup of the not-quite tea and deep into the procedural requirements when Ironhook appeared in the doorway. "You're still here," Ironhook said. "You sound surprised. I expected you to have either left or broken something else." "The night's young," Tony said, and held up the book he was reading. "Kashtarik. Can you file one against a sitting member of the Wiesengemot?" Ironhook walked into the room and sat down across from him at the reading table. He did not look surprised by the question, which Tony noted. "In theory," Ironhook said. "In practice, no one has attempted it against someone of Dumbledore's political standing because the ministry would apply considerable pressure to prevent. The kashtarik is a goblin legal mechanism," Tony said. "It doesn't go through the ministry. It goes through the goblin tribunal." He showed Ironhook the page. Chapter 7, Section 4. The Goblin Banking Authority operates independently of the Ministry of Magic under the Treaty of 1752, and financial accountability proceedings under Goblin law are not subject to ministry oversight. He looked up. Dumbledore's political standing at the ministry is irrelevant. Ironhook looked at the page for a long time. "You found that in 4 hours," he said. 4.5. "I'm still finding things." Tony put the book down. "Here's what I think the full picture looks like. You have a minor account holder who has never accessed his vault and has not been informed it exists. You have a trustee who has been drawing from that vault quarterly for 9 years under an administrative expense designation that has no corresponding documentation. I'm assuming there's no documentation, because if there were, your system would have it and the irregularity flag would have been cleared." He looked at Ironhook. "There's no documentation, is there?" "There is not," Ironhook said quietly. "So you have undocumented withdrawals totaling approximately 2 million galleons from a minor's protected estate trust." Tony ticked the points off on his fingers. "You have a trustee who is simultaneously one of the most politically powerful figures in the wizarding world, which is presumably why nobody has pushed on this before. And you have a goblin legal mechanism specifically designed for exactly this scenario that doesn't require ministry approval." He put his hands flat on the table. "What you need is a clean discrepancy claim that establishes the irregularity formally, which I can file because I have standing, which triggers the kashtarik, which compels Dumbledore to appear before a tribunal he can't politically pressure or dismiss." Ironhook looked at him for a long time. "There is one problem," he said. "There are probably several," Tony said. "Which one are you thinking of?" "The primary account holder." Ironhook folded his hands. "Harry Potter. He is 11 years old, he has never been to Gringotts, and he does not know any of this exists. For the kashtarik to have maximum legal force, for it to be substantially difficult to contest, the account holder himself should be present. So we need to find him," Tony said. "We need to find him," Ironhook agreed. "And given that he is a minor living with Muggle guardians who are not his legal family under Goblin law, and given that the current guardian of record under the trust designation is the same individual we are proposing to file against, we need to find him without Dumbledore finding out we're finding him," Tony finished. He picked up his device. I have an address. Number 4, Privet Drive, Little Whinging, Surrey. He looked up. How fast can you get me to Surrey? In the interest of full disclosure, Ironhook said, Gringotts does not typically transport clients. But? Tony said, because there was clearly a but. But, Ironhook said, with the particular expression of a goblin making a decision that his professional forebears would find highly irregular, Gringotts does occasionally employ external agents for sensitive tasks where the bank's direct involvement would be premature. Tony stared at him. Are you hiring me? He said. I am retaining you, Ironhook said, as a temporary consultant in an active internal audit. Which means the bank provides logistical support for activities related to the audit. Which includes, in this case, transit. Tony sat back in his chair and looked at the goblin who had been doing this for 114 years, and who had apparently decided, over the course of one afternoon, that a 10-year-old muggle from another dimension was worth taking a very large institutional gamble on. You've been waiting for a reason to move on this, Tony said. Not unkindly. Gringotts does not speculate, Ironhook said. Right. Tony stood up, tucking the device under his arm. He was small for 10, and the ceiling of the library was high, and the shelves were tall, and he was surrounded by 114 years of carefully maintained institutional caution. He looked completely at home. Then let's stop speculating and file the claim. Sharpfong was waiting outside the library door. She had, Tony realized, been there the whole time. She held out a document, dense, official, sealed at the top with what looked like gold ink, and a very small, very precise pen that felt heavier than it looked. Sign at the bottom, she said. Full name. Age. And the access method you used to obtain the records, in your own words. Tony took the pen. He read the document in full, all 4 pages of it, while Sharpfong and Ironhook watched in silence, and then he signed it without hesitation. Anthony Edward Stark, age 10. Muggle computational device interfaced with Goblin enchantment carrier wave via electromagnetic signal bridge. Access duration, 7 minutes, 43 seconds. Evidence attached. He handed it back. Sharpfong looked at the signature. Then she looked at Tony. Then she pressed the gold seal at the top of the document and it made a sound like a very clean, very final click, and the pages glowed briefly and went still. The claim is registered, she said. The audit is formally open. She tucked the document under her arm. The bank will arrange transit to Surrey. A security consultant will accompany you. I don't need a babysitter, Tony said. You are 10 years old, unregistered in this world, carrying evidence of financial fraud against the most powerful wizard in Britain, and you have no magic, Sharpfong said, in the tone of someone reading a weather report. You need a babysitter. Tony opened his mouth. Griphook will go with you, Sharpfong said, in the tone of someone not taking further questions on this subject. And that was how Tony Stark, 10 years old, from a different dimension, armed with a Stark pad and a formally registered goblin discrepancy claim, ended up with an official Gringotts security escort to Little Whinging, Surrey, to find the boy who lived, who had no idea any of this was coming. The document in Sharpfang's hands contained, along with Tony's signature, a complete copy of the ledger data. Every transaction. Every date. Every galleon. 2,147,812. In gold ink that couldn't be altered, in records that couldn't be denied, in a case that was now, officially, irrevocably, in the most binding legal framework the wizarding world possessed, open. Outside, Gringotts went on doing business. Tellers processed deposits. Vault runners navigated the underground rails. 200 years of institutional reputation conducted its Wednesday. And somewhere in the restricted record vault on sublevel 4, in a file that had sat untouched for 9 years, a document about a boy named Harry Potter began, for the first time, to be relevant. Chapter 3, Breadcrumbs. The Ministry of Magic transit system, Tony discovered, was nothing like a subway. It was, in fact, a network of enchanted fireplaces connected by something called the Fleur network, which Griphook explained with the enthusiasm of someone reading the safety instructions on a fire extinguisher, technically thorough, emotionally absent. You threw powder into the fire, stepped in, said your destination clearly, and the network did the rest. What if you said the destination unclearly? Tony asked. You end up somewhere else, Griphook said. How somewhere else? Depends on the mispronunciation. Tony looked at the fireplace. It was burning green, which was already wrong in every chemical sense he understood about combustion, and it was tall enough for him to step into, which felt like a design flaw from a safety perspective. I'll take the car, Tony said. There is always a car, Tony said. There was, eventually, a car. Not through the Fleur network, which Tony declined on the grounds that he didn't trust any transit system whose failure mode was somewhere else, but through a Gringotts contracted driver named Abelard who had a black car, a ministry-issued discretion charm, and the particular quality of absolute silence that Tony associated with extremely professional people who were very good at their jobs and had heard everything and said nothing. Griphook sat in the back with Tony and spent the 3-hour drive to Surrey reading what appeared to be a goblin newspaper, ignoring Tony with the practiced ease of someone who had made a professional decision not to be charmed. Tony spent the drive going back through everything on the device. He'd pulled more than he'd told Iron Hook about. The 6-minute access window had been enough to get the ledger data, the transaction records, the trust designations, the quarterly routing pattern, but in the last 90 seconds before the security flags triggered, he'd drifted sideways into an adjacent data structure that he hadn't fully catalogued yet. He'd been saving it. He catalogued it now. It was an account access log. Different from the transaction ledger, this wasn't money moving, this was people moving. A record of every individual who had accessed account-related information at Gringotts, including trust review requests and guardianship designation queries. The kind of record you'd keep to track who was making decisions about what. The Potter account had been accessed 7 times in the 9 years since 1981. 6 of those 7 accesses were by Dumbledore. Quarterly trust reviews, each one brief, 20 minutes or under, each one followed within the week by the administrative expense transfer. The pattern was almost mechanical. Dumbledore reviewed the trust, Dumbledore moved the money. Reviewed and moved, for 9 consecutive years. Tony sat with that for a minute. The mechanical regularity of it. It wasn't the pattern of someone who felt guilty. It was the pattern of someone who had decided this was fine, who had found an internal justification years ago and stopped revisiting it. That was, in Tony's experience, more disturbing than guilt. Guilt meant you still knew it was wrong. This looked like someone who'd made peace with it so thoroughly that it had become administrative routine. He kept reading. The 7th access was the one that made him sit up straighter. It was dated November 3, 1981, 2 days after the night Dumbledore had apparently first designated himself trustee. But the access wasn't logged to Dumbledore. The account code was different, flagged with a series of goblin notations he hadn't fully decoded yet, and the access type was listed as something that translated roughly as estate inquiry, emergency family standing. He pulled up the translation index Sharp Fong had given him, she'd handed it over without comment when he was leaving, which he'd appreciated, and worked through the notations. Emergency family standing inquiry. Initiated in connection with, Black, Serious O, account status, closed pending criminal proceedings. Tony stared at that. Then he opened a new file on the device and started writing. Sirius Black. He typed the name and stared at it. The name appeared in the ledger in connection with the Potter account, not as a trustee, not as a beneficiary, but as someone who had made an emergency inquiry about the estate within 48 hours of whatever event had triggered the trust designation in the first place. And whose account had then been closed pending criminal proceedings. Tony didn't know enough about this world to know what that meant yet. But he knew what it looked like. It looked like someone who had been connected to the Potter account and then abruptly removed from the picture. He typed, find the trial records. Black, Serious, criminal case, 1981. He was still typing when Abelard said, quietly, "Privet Drive, sir," and the car turned onto a street that was so relentlessly, aggressively normal that it was almost aggressive about it. Every house was identical. Every lawn was trimmed to the same height. Every car in every driveway was clean and sensible and beige or silver or gray. Even the trees looked like they'd been asked to tone it down. Number 4 had a doormat that said welcome in the way that things say welcome when they don't mean it. Tony looked at it through the car window for a moment. "Wait here," he told Griphook. "I am your security consultant," Griphook said. "I do not wait in cars." "You're a goblin in a Surrey cul-de-sac at 10 in the morning," Tony said. "How's that going to go?" Griphook looked out the window at the twitching curtain of number 6 across the street. He looked back at Tony. "I will wait in the car," Griphook said. Tony got out. He stood on the pavement in front of number 4 for a moment, assessing. The house was well maintained in a way that meant the owners cared very much what the neighbors thought. The curtains in the front room were open and he could see, through the glass, the edge of what appeared to be an enormous television and the back of a very wide head in an armchair. The kind of head that belonged to a man who was both large and entirely satisfied with himself. There was a sound coming from the back garden. A small, rhythmic sound, the scrape and thud of someone doing light manual work. Pulling weeds, maybe, or digging. Tony walked around the side of the house. The garden was large and better kept than it needed to be, full of flowers arranged with the rigid precision of someone who wanted their garden to look like a magazine cover. In the far corner, kneeling on the ground next to a flower bed, was a boy. He was small, smaller than Tony expected for 11, and Tony was not large himself, with dark hair that looked like it had never successfully been combed, and glasses that were held together at one hinge with a piece of sellotape. His jeans had a hole in the knee and were about 2 sizes too large, belted tight at the waist with what appeared to be a piece of rope. He was weeding the flower bed with a focused, automatic efficiency that suggested he'd done this many times, which suggested it wasn't a choice. He hadn't noticed Tony yet. Tony watched him for a moment, and something cold and specific settled in his chest, not pity exactly, because pity was a soft thing and what he felt was harder than that. It was recognition. The particular recognition of seeing someone who had learned to make themselves small and useful because those were the only options available. "Harry Potter," Tony said. The boy startled so hard he nearly fell over. He spun around, and his eyes, which were very green, which Tony noted with no particular context to attach it to, went wide behind the sellotaped glasses. How do you know my name?" Harry said. He scrambled to his feet, and Tony revised his assessment of small upward to severely underfed, which did nothing to improve the temperature of the thing in his chest. "Are you from school?" "Did Dudley, I don't know anyone named Dudley," Tony said. "My name is Tony. I need to talk to you about something, and it's going to sound crazy." Harry stared at him. He appeared to be doing a rapid assessment of his own, looking at Tony's jeans, his jacket, the device visible at his hip, and then looking at the house, and then back at Tony, with the particular wariness of a kid who had learned that unexpected things were usually bad. "How did you get into the garden?" Harry asked. "The side gate was unlocked." "You're not supposed to." Harry stopped. Something moved in his expression, a brief and complicated thing. "Did someone send you?" "Not in the way you mean," Tony said. He glanced at the house. "Can we talk somewhere your relatives won't see us?" Harry looked at him for another moment, then looked at the back fence, which had a gate to a narrow lane beyond it. He made the decision quickly, which Tony thought said something about how used he was to conversations that needed to be hidden from the people he lived with. They sat in the lane on an upturned milk crate and a section of low wall respectively, Tony on the wall, Harry on the crate because he'd moved it without being asked, the reflex of someone used to making himself less comfortable than other people, and Tony opened the device and turned it so Harry could see the screen. "Gringotts Bank," Tony said. "Do you know what that is?" Harry shook his head. "It's a bank. In a place called Diagon Alley, in London, which is a part of the world that, look, this is the crazy part. You're a wizard. Harry stared at him. I'm not, Harry said. Your parents were. Your dad was James Potter, your mum was Lily Evans Potter. You have a vault at Gringotts that's been managed by a trustee since 1981 because you were a baby and couldn't manage it yourself. Tony watched Harry's face carefully. You've never heard any of this. It wasn't a question. My parents died in a car crash, Harry said, with the flat delivery of something recited from memory. I don't have any money. I sleep in the cupboard under the stairs. The cupboard under the stairs. Tony kept his face even. He was getting very good, in the approximately 30 hours since he'd arrived in this world, at keeping his face even while cataloging things that required a significantly less even response. They didn't die in a car crash, Tony said. I don't know the full story yet. But what I do know, he turned the screen toward Harry, is that you have an account at Gringotts with a significant amount of money in it, and the person who's been managing that account has been taking money out of it every quarter for 9 years. Harry looked at the screen. He looked at the numbers. Tony watched him try to process the number of zeros and get lost and try again. That's mine. Harry said. It's your inheritance. From your parents. Harry was quiet for a moment that had significant weight. How much is gone? He asked. His voice was careful in the way that things are careful when they're trying not to hope too hard. But there was something else in it too, something that wasn't about the money at all. Something that was about the fact that an inheritance meant parents, and parents meant a history he'd never been given. About 2 million galleons, Tony said. I don't know the exact exchange rate, but it's a lot. Who took it? Tony had thought about this moment on the drive from London. He'd thought about whether to lead with it or build to it or frame it carefully. He'd thought about what it would mean to a kid who had never been told anything, to be told this particular thing, about this particular person. Then he'd decided that Harry Potter had been lied to by careful adults his entire life and that the most respectful thing Tony could do was just tell the truth. A man named Albus Dumbledore, Tony said. Harry's expression did something complicated. Not shock, exactly, he'd said the name like he expected it to mean nothing to Harry, and he'd been right, but there was still a register of something. The way you react to hearing a name you've never heard before and somehow still knowing it's important. I don't know him, Harry said. You will, Tony said. He runs the school you're supposed to be going to in September. The wizarding school. He probably intends to send you a letter. How do you know all this? I hacked the bank, Tony said. Harry looked at him. You hacked the bank. I'm good with computers. And also their enchantment carrier systems, apparently. Tony closed the device. Here's the important thing. Gringotts has opened a formal audit. The records are locked, nobody can change them. But for the legal process to work as well as it needs to, you should come with me. To Gringotts. Harry was quiet for a moment. The lane was very still. Somewhere nearby a lawnmower started up and then stopped again. The people in that house, Harry said carefully, nodding toward number 4. My aunt and uncle. Did they know about this? The money, the wizard stuff. Tony thought about the file. The guardianship designation. The Dursley family listed as Muggle guardians while Dumbledore held the financial trustee role. The layered arrangement that had put Harry somewhere nobody with wizarding knowledge would think to look for him and somewhere nobody with guardianship authority over his finances would think to check on him. I think, Tony said, choosing his words, that they probably knew you were different and were probably told to treat you like you weren't. I think the person who set up that arrangement thought he was doing what was necessary. He paused. I think he was wrong. Harry looked at the house again. There was a long pause. Can I get my things? Harry said. How much do you have? Harry's expression did something that he covered quickly. Not much. Then yeah, Tony said. Get your things. Harry got his things in 4 minutes, which meant his things fit in a single backpack, which meant this was another data point in the growing file under things that are garbage that happened to Harry Potter that Tony was compiling with the focused energy of someone building a legal brief. He appeared at the back gate with the backpack over one shoulder and the specific careful blankness of a kid who had learned not to show relief too early. Tony didn't comment on the speed or the backpack or any of it. He just said, "Cars out front," and led the way. When Harry saw Griphook, he stopped walking. Griphook looked at Harry with the expression of a goblin who had seen everything and was nevertheless clocking the sellotape on the glasses and the rope belt and making some kind of internal note. "Harry Potter," Griphook said. "Hello," Harry said, with remarkable composure. Griphook. "Gringotts security." "Okay," Harry said. They got in the car. Abelard pulled away from Privet Drive without comment, which Tony appreciated enormously. In the rearview mirror, Tony caught a brief glimpse of number 4, the twitching curtain, still twitching, already resettled, and then the street of identical houses scrolled past and was gone. Harry sat very still in the back seat for about 5 minutes. Tony let him be still. Then Harry said, quietly, "Do you know anything else about my parents?" "Not much yet," Tony said honestly. "Your dad was James Potter. Your mum was Lily. They had money, which means they had standing in your world. There was something that happened in 1981, I don't know the full story, that resulted in you being placed with your relatives and the trust being designated to Dumbledore." He paused. "There's also a name in the records that I haven't fully traced yet. Someone named Sirius Black, who made an inquiry about your estate right after 1981 and then had his own account closed due to criminal proceedings." Harry turned to look at him. "Who's that?" "I don't know yet. But the timing is odd." Tony picked up the device. "I was going to dig into it more on the way back." "Can I see?" Harry asked. Tony looked at him. The kid was 11, he'd been gardening in rope-belted hand-me-downs in a Surrey cul-de-sac an hour ago, and he was sitting in a Goblin bank-hired car asking to look at the data files. Tony handed over the device without hesitation. Harry looked at it carefully. He didn't try to touch anything, he just looked, the way you look at something you want to understand before you interact with it. "This is Muggle technology," Harry said. "Yes. You're not a wizard." "No." "Then how did you?" Harry stopped. "You said you hacked the bank." "Your world has magic," Tony said, "and magic runs on consistent rules, and consistent rules can be interfaced with if you approach them correctly. The medium is different from what I'm used to, but the underlying logic isn't." He glanced at Harry. "Your world has a lot of things that people treat as mysterious that are actually just systems. And systems can be understood." Harry looked at the device for a long moment. "Nobody's ever done anything like this for me before," he said. "Not emotional about it, just stating a fact, the way you state facts when you've arranged them carefully enough that they don't hurt anymore." "I know," Tony said. Harry handed the device back. They drove in silence for a while. The English countryside slid past the windows in its green, unassuming way, and the London skyline began to build on the horizon. Tony went back to the Sirius Black notation. The Goblin translation index was good but not complete, and the Black account notations were layered in a way that suggested multiple overlapping legal statuses. He worked through them methodically. Criminal account freeze, standard. Azkaban designation, he stopped at that. He pulled up a different file, one of the legal texts Sharp Fong had included in the transit package because she was apparently the kind of person who anticipated what research someone would need and provided it without being asked. Azkaban. Wizarding prison. Maximum security. Administered by the Department of Magical Law Enforcement under Ministry oversight. He searched for Sirius Black in the index Sharp Fong had given him. Nothing. He searched the wider legal archive that Gringotts had given him red access to as part of the formal audit. He found the case file for Sirius Orion Black, charged November 1981. Imprisoned November 1981. Azkaban, life sentence. He searched for the trial transcript. It didn't exist. He searched again, differently, in case it was cross-referenced under a different heading. Still nothing. He searched for the ministry hearing record. For the evidence log. For the Wiesengemot proceedings entry. For any of the standard documentation that should accompany a life sentence. Nothing. 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 Sirius Black had been sent to Azkaban for life without a trial. Tony put the device down very slowly on his knee and looked out the window at the motorway and the grey sky above it and the traffic moving in the ordinary way that traffic moves when the world is carrying on without knowing that something has gone badly wrong inside it. Tony. Harry said. 1 second, Tony said. He picked the device back up and went through it again. Not because he thought he'd missed something, he hadn't missed something, but because you always checked twice. You always made sure the data was what you thought it was before you acted on it. It was what he thought it was. Sirius Black had been put in a maximum security prison for life in November 1981 without a single piece of official legal process. No trial. No hearing. No formally recorded evidence. Just an arrest and a sentence and a door closing. In the same month that James and Lily Potter had died. In the same month that Harry Potter had been placed with the Dursleys. In the same month that Albus Dumbledore had designated himself financial trustee of a 2-year-old's estate. November 1981 was beginning to look very crowded with decisions that hadn't been questioned. Your parents' death, Tony said. He kept his voice level. Do you know anything about it? More than the car crash story. Harry shook his head slowly. There was someone who might have been connected to your family, Tony said carefully. He's in Azkaban, the wizarding prison. He was put there without a trial. Harry looked at him. Without a trial, Harry repeated. No hearing, no evidence record, no Wiesengemot proceedings. Nothing. Tony turned to face him fully. Which is either a record-keeping failure on a catastrophic scale, or, someone put him there and didn't want it questioned, Harry said. 10-year-old Tony looked at 11-year-old Harry, and felt the particular recognition of two people whose life experiences had given them a similar education in how power actually works. Yeah, Tony said. That's what I think too. Grip Hook, who had been reading his newspaper with absolute apparent concentration, folded it very precisely and set it on his knee without looking up from it. The individual you are discussing, Grip Hook said, in the tone of someone entering a conversation that he'd been listening to for some time, is flagged in the Gringotts Security Archive as a person of interest in relation to the Potter account. Tony stared at him. You knew. Gringotts does not speculate, Grip Hook said, which Tony was beginning to understand was the institutional version of yes, but I couldn't say so until you said it first. He's flagged how? Tony asked. As the original designated beneficiary of the Potter family secondary trust. The designation was recorded in July 1981, 4 months before the events of November. Grip Hook refolded the newspaper with unnecessary precision. His designation was voided when he was imprisoned. The voiding was processed by the same office that designated Dumbledore as primary trustee. Harry made a sound that wasn't quite a word. So this man, Tony said. Sirius Black. He was supposed to be connected to Harry's estate. Legitimately. Before November. And then he was arrested without trial immediately after, and Dumbledore stepped in. You said it, Grip Hook said. I didn't. But the records show it. The records show exactly what they show, Grip Hook said, in the tone of someone who was technically not confirming anything while confirming everything. Tony looked at Harry. Harry was looking at his hands, which were folded in his lap with the deliberate stillness of someone managing something large. He had the expression of a person receiving too much new information too quickly and refusing to let it capsize him. Hey, Tony said. Harry looked up. We're going to figure all of this out, Tony said. Not gently, Tony didn't do gently, it came out wrong, but with the specific weight of a statement that was true and meant to be taken as true. The money, the trust, Sirius Black, all of it. We're going to build a case that is so clean and so documented that nobody can look away from it. He held up the device. I have the data. Gringotts has the original records. And we now have a legal mechanism that doesn't go through the ministry, which means Dumbledore can't suppress it politically. He paused. But I need you with me on this. Not just as the account holder, as someone who actually wants to know the truth. Harry looked at him for a long moment. I've wanted to know the truth my entire life, Harry said quietly. Good, Tony said. Then we're going to get along fine. The London skyline was close now. The spires and glass of the city were accumulating on the horizon, and somewhere in it, invisible to everyone who wasn't looking for it, was Diagon Alley, and Gringotts, and a sealed document bearing Tony's signature, and a legal case that was already, technically, in motion. Tony opened the device again. While we drive, he said, tell me everything you know about Dumbledore. Everything, teachers who've mentioned him, things you've overheard, anything. Even if it seems small. Harry thought about it seriously. I heard my aunt say his name once. She sounded scared. Why? I don't know. She said that man, and then she stopped talking when she noticed I was listening. Tony typed that down. Tell me about your aunt and uncle, he said. Specifically, did they ever say anything about why you were with them? Anything about your parents beyond the car crash story? My uncle said once that my parents were. Harry stopped. His jaw tightened slightly. He said they were freaks and that I was a freak too, and that he wasn't going to have freakishness in his house. He said it flatly, having clearly said it to himself before in the process of neutralizing its power over him. Tony typed it down. He was building something. He could feel the architecture of it assembling in his mind the way machines assembled, not in one piece but in the accumulation of components, each one small, each one precise, each one connecting to the next with increasing inevitability until the structure became visible. A money trail. A missing trial. A child in a cupboard. A trustee who reviewed accounts quarterly and moved funds with the ease of someone who had convinced himself it was fine. The components were connecting. And somewhere in Hogwarts or the Ministry or wherever Dumbledore was currently being quietly powerful, Tony suspected that the man had absolutely no idea that a 10-year-old from a different dimension had spent the last day and a half reading his ledger. That, Tony thought, was exactly how he wanted it. One more question, Tony said. Yeah. Harry said. When your letter comes, for the school, Hogwarts, in September, what are you planning to do with it? Harry looked at him. There was something in his expression that was very nearly the first genuinely unguarded thing Tony had seen from him, something that was almost 9 years old instead of 11, and had been waiting a very long time. Go, Harry said. Obviously. Tony nodded. Good. Because you're going to need to be there for what I'm planning. He closed the device. Also, and this is a separate issue, you need glasses that aren't held together with tape. Harry blinked. Then, to Tony's genuine surprise, the corner of his mouth moved. They're fine, Harry said. They're an engineering failure, Tony said. They work. The tape is load-bearing, Tony said. That's not fine, that's improvised structural support on a medical device. Harry's mouth moved again, more definitely this time, and this time it made it all the way to a real expression, small and cautious, but real. They were back in London by mid-afternoon, and Gringotts was white and gold against the grey sky, and Ironhook was waiting at the top of the steps. He looked at Harry with the particular attention of someone who has been managing someone's money for 9 years without ever seeing their face. He didn't say anything immediately. Just looked. Harry looked back. Mr. Potter, Ironhook said finally. Welcome to Gringotts. And something in Harry's posture shifted, almost imperceptible, but Tony caught it, the very small straightening of someone who has just been welcomed somewhere, by name, for the first time in a very long time. Thank you, Harry said, and his voice was steady. They went in. Behind them, on the street, Abelard pulled the car away. Griphook folded his newspaper under his arm and climbed the marble steps. The doors of Gringotts closed behind them all with the heavy, final sound of very serious stone, and inside, in the deep records, the audit was open, the documents were sealed, and the case was building. And in a subterranean office 3 floors below the main lobby, Sharp Fong was already pulling the secondary files, the ones that connected the financial irregularities to the guardianship records, to the criminal case, to the missing trial. The breadcrumbs were becoming a path. And the path was leading somewhere that Albus Dumbledore, for all his considerable foresight, had not foreseen. Chapter 4, The Boy Under the Stairs. Harry's vault was on the first level down. Not the deep levels. Tony had glimpsed the routing architecture for those during his access window, and they went down far enough that the map stopped being reassuring, but the first level, which was where the old established families kept their primary accounts. The cart ride down was exactly as chaotic as Tony had expected from a transport system built by people who apparently found dragon security reasonable, and Harry gripped the side of the cart with both hands and didn't make a sound, which told Tony 2 things, that Harry was not someone who showed fear easily, and that Harry was absolutely terrified. Tony was also terrified, for the record. He just thought the engineering was interesting. The vault door was round and iron and covered in the kind of engravings that were both decorative and almost certainly lethal if you touched them wrong. Ironhook pressed his palm flat against the center and spoke 3 syllables in Goblin that Tony's ears couldn't quite parse, and the door swung open with the unhurried confidence of something that had never needed to hurry. Harry stood in the doorway and looked at his inheritance. It was a lot of gold. Tony didn't have the wizarding economy fully calibrated yet, but he'd done enough reading to know that what was in this vault represented generational wealth, the kind that had been building for decades before Harry was born and would have kept building if someone hadn't been quietly redirecting the interest. Harry stood there for a long moment. Tony stood next to him and didn't say anything. Sometimes the right move was not talking, which Tony had been told his entire life and had a very mixed record of executing on, but this was one of the times he managed it. They were real, Harry said finally. Very quietly. Not to Tony specifically. Just to the room. Tony looked at him. My parents, Harry said. They were real people. They had money and a vault, and, he stopped. He pressed his lips together and looked at the gold with the focus of someone directing all available energy into a single point so that it doesn't go anywhere inconvenient. Tony said, yeah. They were real. Harry nodded. One sharp nod. Then he walked into the vault and stood in the middle of it and looked around at everything his parents had left him, and Tony stood in the doorway and gave him the 2 minutes he clearly needed, and Ironhook stood behind Tony and said absolutely nothing, which Tony was beginning to think was one of the more underrated qualities a person could have. Then Harry turned around and said, okay. What do we need to do? And they got to work. Ironhook had arranged a meeting room on the 2nd floor of the banking complex, not the public areas but the internal ones, which looked nothing like the marble lobby. Down here the walls were rough stone and the furniture was iron and the light came from the same blue-white flames Tony had seen in the law library. The table was wide enough to spread everything out on, and Sharp Fong was already there when they arrived, with 2 other goblins Tony hadn't met and a stack of documents that reached her chin. The 2 goblins were introduced as Cleftjaw, who handled goblin tribunal procedures, and Bitterstone, who was apparently the senior archivist for the restricted estate records. They both looked at Tony and Harry with the assessing quality of professionals deciding how much a new variable would complicate their existing plan. Tell me you have the trial records, Tony said, dropping into a chair. There are no trial records, Bitterstone said, and the way he said it made clear he'd looked. Right. I found that. What about the arrest record? The charge documentation? Anything from the Ministry of Magic Law Enforcement from November 1981 related to Sirius Black? Bitterstone set a single sheet of parchment on the table. Tony picked it up. It was sparse. Disturbingly sparse. Name, date, charge, which was listed as conspiracy to commit murder and betrayal of the Potters to he who must not be named, sentence, prisoner number. No hearing date. No presiding magistrate. No evidence summary. No defense counsel notation. He who must not be named, Tony said. Voldemort, Harry said, which made Cleftjaw and Bitterstone both flinch slightly. Harry noticed. His expression didn't change. My aunt said that name once. When she didn't know I was listening. She said he killed my parents. Silence around the table. Tony looked at Harry. You knew that already. I knew it wasn't a car crash, Harry said. I didn't know the name. He said it again, deliberately, like he was testing it. Voldemort. My parents were killed by Voldemort. And then Sirius Black was put in prison for it, Tony said, looking back at the arrest sheet. Without a trial. For allegedly helping Voldemort do it. The arrest was processed by Senior Auror Bartemius Crouch, Bitterstone said, setting another document on the table. He had emergency detention authority under wartime provisions that had been active since 1979. The authority allowed detention without trial pending hearing, with a maximum administrative hold of 30 days. And the hearing never happened, Tony said. The hearing was never scheduled, Bitterstone said. Tony set the arrest sheet down. He looked at it. He looked at the meeting room, at the documents, at Harry sitting across from him reading the same arrest sheet upside down with the expression of someone who was being very calm about something that deserved a much stronger reaction than calm. Harry, Tony said. Harry looked up. Sirius Black was designated as your secondary beneficiary in July 1981, Tony said. That's a legal relationship. That's not something you do for a casual acquaintance. That's something you do for someone you trust completely. He could have been my godfather, Harry said. The word sat in the air for a moment. Tony looked at the documents. Something clicked into place with the mechanical precision of a well-made lock. A godfather. Designated secondary beneficiary, which under wizarding inheritance law, Bitterstone had explained during Tony's research session, was specifically the role of a magical guardian, distinct from the financial trustee. If Sirius Black had been Harry's designated magical guardian, the person James and Lily Potter had trusted to raise their son if something happened to them, and Dumbledore had designated himself financial trustee, and Sirius Black had been arrested without trial within 48 hours, the structure of November 1981 was becoming visible. Sharp Fong, Tony said. Yes. If a designated magical guardian is imprisoned, what happens to the guardianship designation? It is voided, Sharp Fong said. Immediately and automatically. The next in line assumes, who was next in line. Sharp Fong set another document on the table. Tony read it. The secondary guardian designation, below Sirius Black, was listed as Peter Pettigrew, who was noted as deceased November 1, 1981. The tertiary designation below that had been struck through and marked ineligible with a ministry stamp Tony didn't have the translation reference for. Below that, the field was blank. When all designated guardians are unavailable, Cleftjaw said, in the tone of someone reading from a statute, guardianship defaults to the next available magical family member. In the absence of magical family, he paused, to the discretion of the chief warlock of the Wizengamot, pending a formal hearing. Who was the chief warlock in November 1981, Tony said. Nobody said it. They didn't need to. He removed everyone who could have taken Harry, Tony said. He was not loud about it. He was very precise about it, in the way he was precise when he was doing something that required accuracy above everything else. Sirius Black goes to prison without a trial, no guardianship. Peter Pettigrew is dead. The tertiary guardian is disqualified. What does ineligible mean on that stamp? Disqualified under wartime security provisions, Bitterstone said. It's a ministry stamp. Applied by the same office as the Black arrest. So the same office that arrested Black without a trial also disqualified the tertiary guardian. Tony leaned back in his chair. And then Dumbledore, as chief warlock, steps in for the guardianship determination, places Harry with Muggle relatives, and simultaneously designates himself financial trustee of Harry's estate. He looked around the table. Does everyone here understand what I'm describing? We understand, Ironhook said, from the end of the table where he'd been standing in silence for the last 20 minutes. I want to be clear that I'm not speculating about motive, Tony said. I'm not saying he did this with malicious intent. I'm saying the documented sequence of events, across multiple records that are independently verified, shows one person making a series of decisions that consecutively removed every obstacle between him and complete control over Harry Potter's life and finances. He picked up the arrest sheet. And that the first and foundational decision, the one that started the chain, was a man being put in prison for life without a trial. Harry had been very still for the last several minutes. Tony looked at him. Harry was looking at the arrest sheet on the table, the one with Sirius Black's name on it, the sparse and terrible document that was the entire official record of a man's life sentence, and his expression had gone past the careful blankness that Tony had been watching him maintain since Privet Drive. It wasn't anger. It was something under anger, which was worse. He had a choice, Harry said quietly. Whoever did this. They had a choice. Nobody disagreed. Dumbledore had a choice, Harry said. He could have made sure there was a trial. He could have, if he's as powerful as you're saying, as Chief Warlock, he could have made the trial happen. He could have checked. Harry's voice was steady and terrible. But there's no trial because someone decided it was easier without one. Tony looked at him. And I was in a cupboard, Harry said. For 10 years. While someone was managing my money and running my school, and the whole time, he stopped. He picked up the arrest sheet and held it and then set it back down very deliberately. Is he still there? Sirius Black. Is he still in Azkaban? As far as the records show, Tony said. Yes. Then we get him out, Harry said. That's part of this. Whatever we're building, whatever case we're making, that has to be part of it. It is, Tony said. It was always going to be part of it. Harry looked at him. You already planned for that. The minute I found the no-trial documentation, Tony said. Yeah. Something shifted in Harry's expression. Not the cautious small movement Tony had seen in the car, this was more substantial. Like a foundation settling into place. Okay, Harry said. Tell me what you need from me. The next 3 hours were the most productive Tony had experienced since arriving in this world, which was saying something given the previous 36 hours. Harry was, it turned out, an excellent research collaborator. He read fast, asked precise questions, and had a memory for detail that was probably genetic because it was very difficult to explain otherwise. He cross-referenced documents the way Tony did, building chains of logic rather than accepting isolated facts, and he had a quality that Tony recognized and respected enormously. He didn't flinch from information because it was uncomfortable. Bitterstone walked them through the financial architecture of the Potter Estate Trust in detail, and Harry asked questions that made the archivist blink twice and then answer with increasing respect. Tony mapped the legal timeline on the device: arrest, guardianship default, trustee designation, first withdrawal, and Harry traced the pattern and said, every decision feeds into the next one. It's not random. It's not random, Tony agreed. It's a system, Harry said, and his voice was very even. He built a system. Sharp Fong, who had been watching this exchange from her end of the table with the expression of a person revising an assessment, set a new document on the table. This arrived while you were at the vault, she said, to Harry specifically. Harry looked at it. It was an envelope, thick cream paper, sealed with red wax in the shape of an H over a crest. His name was on it in green ink, in handwriting that had clearly been enchanted to know exactly where to find him, because it said Mr. H. Potter, the first-level meeting room, Gringotts Bank, Diagon Alley. Harry looked at it for a moment. My Hogwarts letter, he said. A month early, Tony noted, looking at the seal. You said they usually come in August? Standard practice, Cleftjaw confirmed. The early delivery suggests a special designation. Harry broke the seal and read the letter. His expression didn't change much, but Tony watched his eyes move through it twice. "I'm invited to meet with the headmaster before term," Harry said. "At his convenience, at Hogwarts. It says he'd like to personally ensure I have everything I need for my first year." He set the letter on the table. "He wants to see me before September." "Of course he does," Tony said. "You've just shown up at Gringotts for the first time. His access logs will show the account was accessed, by you specifically, the primary holder, and he'll want to know why, and he'll want to get in front of whatever you found before you can do anything with it." "He'll want to explain it," Harry said. "He'll have an explanation." "He'll have a very good explanation," Tony said. "He probably believes it himself." He leaned forward. "Don't go." "Not yet." Harry looked at him. "Not until we're ready," Tony said. "When you meet Dumbledore, you need to have everything locked down, the case filed, the Kashtarik in process, the black trial documentation submitted. Because once he knows you know, he'll move. He has resources and political standing and 100 years of people trusting him completely." Tony looked at the letter. "You're not afraid of him?" "No," Harry said simply. "But you should be smart about him. There's a difference between afraid and careful." Harry picked up the letter again and read it a third time. "He says he wants to make sure I have everything I need," he said. "For my first year." "He's been saying that to himself for 9 years," Tony said. "That's the thing. He thinks he's helping. He thinks everything he's done has been necessary and good and for the right reasons, and that makes him." Tony stopped. He thought about his father. About Howard Stark, who also always thought he knew best, who also always had a plan, who also could look at you across a lab bench and genuinely believe, while leaving the do not touch note instead of a lock, that he was doing right by you. It makes him very hard to argue with. Because he'll argue back with sincerity. Harry set the letter down. "Then we don't argue," Harry said. "We just show him the documents." Tony looked at him for a second. Then he said, "Exactly." It was late afternoon when Ironhook called a temporary stop. He set a tray of food on the table, bread and what appeared to be some kind of heavily spiced stew, and the same not quite tea in 2 cups, and something harder in a 3rd cup that Tony assumed was for the goblins, and said that the formal Kashtarik filing would need to wait until morning when the tribunal office opened, and that certain documentation from the Ministry Criminal Records Division would need to be formally requested before the session, and that both Tony and Harry should sleep. "Where?" Tony said. "Gringotts maintains guest quarters for clients involved in sensitive proceedings," Ironhook said, in the tone of someone revealing that this was, technically, a thing that existed. "You have a hotel," Tony said. "We have quarters," Ironhook said. "You have a hotel in a bank." "It is not a hotel. It has rooms with beds in it inside a financial institution," Tony said. "That's a hotel." Ironhook looked at him with the expression of a goblin deciding whether this argument was worth having. "The rooms are on sublevel 2, he said, and left. The rooms were, not hotel rooms, Tony conceded privately, because hotel rooms had soft furnishings and a general attempt at comfort, and these were stone chambers with iron beds and candles and a quality of silence that was more like a held breath than an absence of noise. But the beds were real and the blankets were warm and the pillow was better than anything Tony had slept on in the last 2 nights, which he'd spent on Aldous Pembridge's Ministry Liaison office couch, which had been upholstered in something that felt like institutional disappointment. He lay on his back and stared at the stone ceiling and made a list. Kashtarik filing, morning. Serious black trial documentation, formal ministry records request via goblin legal channel, bypasses ministry political interference. Dumbledore's financial records, need full transaction history not just the routing anomaly, Sharp Fong says this is possible within the audit framework. Harry's guardianship status, currently technically defaulted to Muggle family, need to establish legal standing for challenge. Hogwarts letter, don't respond yet. The missing tertiary guardian, find out who they were and why specifically disqualified, because the specific grounds might be significant. He stared at the ceiling. He thought about the cupboard under the stairs. He'd seen it, obliquely, through the side gate, the door under the staircase of number 4, Privet Drive, fitted with multiple external locks. He'd registered it and filed it and kept moving because there wasn't time to stop and he'd needed to stay functional, which was a thing he knew how to do because he'd been doing it since he was small enough that his father's lab bench was above his eye level. He thought about Harry saying they were real in the vault. He thought about Harry saying we get him out about a man he'd never met and didn't know beyond an arrest record and a financial designation, and meaning it completely. He thought about the architecture of November 1981, the elegant, terrible efficiency of it. Every obstacle removed. Every alternative path closed. One man, at the apex of a very large amount of power, making a series of decisions that he had convinced himself were necessary, and a child put in a cupboard and a man put in a prison and a world that trusted the decisions absolutely because the man who made them was Albus Dumbledore and Albus Dumbledore knew best. Tony thought about his father. He closed his eyes. He was still thinking when he fell asleep, which was typical, and he slept for 6 hours straight, which was atypical but possibly related to having been awake for 38 hours in a dimension that wasn't his. In the room next to his, Harry Potter slept too, which was the first time in as long as he could remember that he'd fallen asleep somewhere that wasn't the cupboard, in a bed that was actually his to sleep in, with documents on the table in the room above him that said his name was his, and his money was his, and his life, whatever had been done to it, was going to be accounted for. He slept deeply, which was also atypical. Tony woke at 6 in the morning with the full list still intact in his head, which was how he knew he'd slept well, and found that someone had slid a document under his door during the night. He picked it up. It was from Sharp Fong. The tertiary guardian designation struck through and marked ineligible, found the full record. Remus J. Lupin. Grounds for ineligibility, registered werewolf. Ministry Provision 1979, Clause 7 of the Werewolf Registry Act. Werewolves may not hold legal guardianship of minor magical children. Tony read it twice. Then he added it to the list. Lupin, Remus, friend of James Potter, designated guardian, disqualified by a ministry law that was on the books before Harry was born. Not a decision made in November 1981. A structural barrier. Pre-existing. He sat on the edge of the iron bed in the stone room and read the document a third time and understood that the architecture of what had happened to Harry Potter was older and more layered than he'd initially assessed. It wasn't just November 1981. It was years of structural conditions, laws and provisions and institutional frameworks, that had conspired to leave a single man as the default authority over a child's life, and whether those structures had been deliberately built toward that outcome or had simply been exploited when the opportunity arose was a question he couldn't answer yet. But he was going to. He got dressed, picked up the device, and went upstairs to find Harry already at the meeting room table with a cup of the not-quite tea and the serious black arrest record in front of him. "How long have you been up?" Tony said. "A while," Harry said. He looked up. "There's tea." "That's not tea," Tony said, but he poured himself a cup and sat down. "I got a note from Sharp Fong. About the tertiary guardian." Harry looked at him steadily. "Who was it?" "Someone named Remus Lupin. He was disqualified under a ministry law about werewolves." Harry absorbed this. "He's a werewolf?" "Apparently. Your parents still named him as tertiary guardian, which means they knew and trusted him anyway." Tony set the device on the table. "Which means there were 3 people, Sirius Black, Peter Pettigrew, and Remus Lupin, who were all connected to your family closely enough to be named in your guardianship chain. And in November 1981, Pettigrew died, Black was imprisoned without trial, and Lupin was disqualified by a pre-existing law." He paused. "We need to find Lupin." "He might not even know," Harry said. "Exactly." Sharp Fong arrived at 7 with Iron Hook and Cleftjaw, and the morning was immediately busy with the procedural requirements of the Kashtaric filing, which was dense and specific in the way of all serious legal processes. Tony and Cleftjaw worked through the filing requirements point by point, the documented discrepancy, the evidence chain, the standing of the complainant, the formal request for tribunal proceedings. Harry sat at Tony's right hand and signed where he was asked to sign, and read everything before he signed it, which made Cleftjaw visibly approve of him. By 10 in the morning the Kashtarik was formally filed. The filing generated 3 copies, one for the tribunal record, one for the respondent's file, which would be delivered to Dumbledore by formal goblin notice, and one for the complainant. Tony held the complainant copy and looked at it. It was real. It was done. The machinery was in motion. When does Dumbledore get notified? He asked. The respondent notice is delivered by goblin courier within 24 hours of filing, Cleftjaw said. The tribunal hearing is scheduled within 30 days. So he knows tomorrow, Harry said. He knows tomorrow, Tony confirmed. He looked at Harry. Which means we have today. Harry met his eyes. For what? For Sirius Black. Tony stood up and picked up the device. The trial that never happened. I want to file the records request today, formal, through the Goblin legal channel, for the complete Ministry criminal case file for Sirius Black, case November 1981. If we're going to make the no-trial argument, we need the formal record showing the absence of proceedings, and we need it submitted to the tribunal as part of the Kashtarik evidence package. The Kashtarik is a financial proceeding, Cleftjaw said. It started as one, Tony said. But the financial mismanagement is connected to the guardianship manipulation, which is connected to the false imprisonment, and in Goblin law, he pulled up the page he'd flagged, Chapter 12, Section 2, a Kashtarik hearing can incorporate related grievances under the doctrine of intertwined harm when the financial crime and the related harms share a common actor and a common purpose. Cleftjaw looked at the page. He looked at Tony. You're 10 years old, he said. Chapter 12, Section 2, Tony said pleasantly. Cleftjaw looked at Ironhook. File the records request, Ironhook said. The records request went out through the Goblin legal channel at 11:15, formally demanding the complete criminal proceedings documentation for one Sirius Orion Black from the Ministry of Magic Department of Magical Law Enforcement. Under Goblin law, a records request issued in the context of an active Kashtarik had a mandatory 7-day response window with a Ministry compliance obligation. The Ministry was not going to enjoy receiving it. Tony was counting on that. He was standing in the lobby of Gringotts at 11:30, looking at the white marble and the gold chandeliers and the tellers in their rows, and thinking about what happened next, when Harry appeared at his shoulder. Tony. Yeah. Thank you. Harry said it without preamble, looking straight ahead at the lobby rather than at Tony, which meant he'd thought about whether to say it and decided the easiest way was to say it to the room. For all of this. You didn't have to. Tony looked at the lobby. I know. You could have you found the discrepancy and you could have told someone else and walked away. I couldn't have, actually, Tony said. That's not how I work. Harry was quiet for a moment. How do you work? Tony thought about it. I see a problem, he said, and I understand it, and then I can't not fix it. It's not a virtue. It's just how I'm built. He glanced at Harry sideways. Also, someone needed to be angry about this on your behalf, and you were being very reasonable about it, and someone had to pick up the slack. Harry's mouth moved. It did the thing it had done in the car, that careful, testing movement toward a real expression. I'm angry, Harry said. I know. You're being controlled angry. Which is effective, don't get me wrong. It's strategic, it keeps you functional, but it also means you haven't had the uncontrolled version yet, and at some point you're going to need to. Harry looked at him. Not today, Tony said. Today we stay functional. But, he paused. When this is done. When the tribunal is over and Sirius Black is out and Dumbledore is sitting across from a formal inquiry, give yourself the uncontrolled version. Just once. He looked back at the lobby. You've earned it. Harry didn't say anything for a moment. Then, how do you know Sirius Black is innocent? I don't, Tony said. Not with certainty. But there's no trial, and that means there's no evidence record, and that means either he was never tried because someone didn't want the evidence examined, or he was never tried because the evidence wasn't strong enough to convict, and either way, he stopped. Either way, a man is in prison for life and nobody ever checked, and that is not something I can let stand. Harry nodded slowly. If he is innocent, Harry said. If he is, Tony said, then you've had a godfather in a cell for 10 years that you didn't know about, and he's had his godson in a cupboard under some stairs that he didn't know about, and that's, Tony stopped. He pressed his mouth together. That's a problem we can fix. So we're going to fix it. The lobby doors opened and Griphook came in from the street, carrying a folded message. He walked directly to Tony and held it out. Tony unfolded it. It was a response. Already, less than an hour after the records request had been filed. Not from the Ministry. From the office of Albus Dumbledore, which meant Dumbledore had a contact inside the Goblin legal courier network who'd flagged the request before it even reached the Ministry. Tony read it. It was, on its face, perfectly pleasant. It expressed Dumbledore's willingness to cooperate with any inquiry and his confidence that any irregularities could be explained to the satisfaction of all parties. It noted that Gringotts had always been a valued institution and that he was sure this matter could be resolved without the need for formal tribunal proceedings. It invited Harry to visit Hogwarts at his earliest convenience for a frank and open conversation. It was, Tony thought, the written equivalent of a very warm hand on your shoulder that was also slightly too firm. He folded it. He knows, Harry said. He'd read it over Tony's shoulder. He knew within the hour, Tony said. Someone flagged the records request. He tucked the letter away. It's fine. We filed before he got the notice. The Kashtarik is in process. The records request is submitted. Everything is locked. He looked at Harry. He can write as many letters as he wants. The documents are real and the process is in motion and there's nothing he can say that changes either of those things. Harry looked at the letter in Tony's hand. He sounds kind, Harry said. He is kind, Tony said. That's the hard part. Harry absorbed this. I still want to meet him, Harry said. Eventually. I want to look at him and let him explain it. He paused. I want to see what he says. You'll get to, Tony said. Tribunal, 30 days. He has to show up. Good, Harry said, and his voice was very quiet and very certain, and 10 years of cupboard under the stairs was in it, not as anger but as something harder and more lasting than anger, a determination that had been running the entire time, waiting for a direction. It had a direction now. Tony pocketed the letter and picked up the device and turned toward the stairs that led back to the meeting room and the documents and the work. Come on, he said. We've got 30 days. Chapter 5, Checkmate in Daylight. The Wizengamot chamber was older than anything Tony had seen in this world, and he'd seen quite a lot of old things in the past 30 days. It was circular, built from black stone that had the deep, settled quality of something that had been in place for centuries and knew it. The tiered seating rose in concentric rings around a central floor, each level higher than the last, the uppermost rows lost in shadow that the enchanted torches didn't quite reach. The seats were high-backed and dark wood, and there were over 100 of them, and most of them were occupied. Tony stood on the central floor and looked up at all of it and thought, structurally, that it was designed to be intimidating. The height of the seats, the downward angle of observation, the way sound moved in the circular space, all of it built to make the person on the floor feel small and visible and assessed. He'd seen the same design principle in courtrooms. In boardrooms. In his father's office, which had a desk on a 2-inch platform that Howard Stark thought nobody had noticed. Tony had always found spaces like this clarifying rather than intimidating. The people looking down at you had to look at you, which meant you had their attention, and attention was the foundation of everything. He had their attention now. Harry stood to Tony's left, in robes that Ironhook had quietly arranged, good ones, dark blue, the kind that said this family has standing without saying anything aloud. Harry's glasses were new too. Tony had taken care of that in the second week. They sat straight on his face and the lenses were clean and there was no tape. Ironhook stood to Tony's right in formal goblin attire, which was considerably more elaborate than his banking clothes and involved a silver chain of office that caught the torchlight in a way that was clearly deliberate. Behind them, at a table along the chamber wall, Sharpfang and Cleftjaw sat with the evidence archive, 12 bound volumes of documentation, 3 independently verified copies of the Gringotts ledger data, and a sealed case file from the Goblin Tribunal that had spent the last 29 days doing the quiet, thorough work of verification that Tony had been counting on. The tribunal had found everything Tony had found, and then found 17 additional things Tony hadn't. It had been, by any measure, a productive month. The Wisingamot was here because the Kashtarik had been filed against a Wisingamot member, and Goblin law required that a member facing a financial accountability proceeding be heard in their own chamber, which Tony had considered a potential weakness until Bitterstone pointed out that it also meant the entire Wisingamot was required to be present, which meant the hearing was public, which meant whatever happened here happened in front of everyone. Tony had thought about that for a long time and then thought that it was, actually, perfect. The murmur in the chamber was significant. Tony had been in this world for 30 days and he'd spent considerable energy learning how it worked, and one of the things he'd learned was that Albus Dumbledore had not been formally challenged in any public proceeding in living memory. The last time someone had publicly questioned Dumbledore, the general view was that they had been wrong to do so. The Wisingamot had that particular quality of people who were here because they felt obligated to be, combined with people who were here because they desperately wanted to know what was going to happen, combined with a smaller number who were here because they already knew and were making very careful choices about their expressions. Minerva McGonagall was in the third tier. Tony had done enough research to know who she was. Deputy Headmistress of Hogwarts, head of Gryffindor House, Dumbledore's second-in-command for 40 years. She was sitting very straight with her hands folded on the railing in front of her and her expression was the most controlled thing in the room. Tony looked at her for a moment and noted that controlled was different from certain, and that the difference mattered. At the upper tier, in the Chief Warlock's chair, which was technically Dumbledore's own seat, which Tony appreciated as an irony, sat a man named Tiberius Ogden, who had been appointed as temporary presiding officer specifically because Dumbledore could not preside over his own hearing. Ogden looked like a man who had agreed to this role before fully understanding what he'd agreed to and was now managing the situation with the professional composure of someone who was very sorry they'd picked up the fire when they'd answered it. Dumbledore himself was seated in the respondent's chair on the opposite side of the central floor from Tony. Tony looked at him for the first time. He had been building a picture of Albus Dumbledore for 30 days from documents and records and second-hand descriptions, and the picture was comprehensive and detailed and had not prepared him for the actual man. Because the actual man looked like someone who had been designed by the specific imagination of a child who needed to believe that wise old men existed, white beard, half-moon spectacles, robes that managed to be simultaneously magnificent and unpretentious, and the effect was powerful in a way that Tony logged carefully. The power wasn't political, though Dumbledore had that too. It was something more fundamental. He looked like someone who knew things and carried them gently and could be trusted to hold them safely. Tony logged that too. Dumbledore was looking at Harry. Harry was looking back. It was the first time they'd seen each other in person, and the quality of the exchange was not what Tony had expected. He'd expected something confrontational, two people across a very loaded space with 9 years of damage between them. Instead it was almost quiet. Dumbledore's expression was something that looked like grief, and Harry's expression was, Tony turned his head slightly to read it, careful. Present. Not performing anything. Just looking. Then Harry looked away first, back to the front, and Dumbledore's expression closed around whatever it had been showing, and the moment was over. Ogden called the session to order and the chamber settled. This proceeding is convened under the Kashtarik provisions of the Goblin Banking Authority, Treaty of 1752, Article 9, Ogden said, with the voice of someone reading from a document he was very glad to have in front of him. The matter before this chamber is the formal discrepancy claim filed against Albus Percival Wulfric Brian Dumbledore in relation to the estate trust of Harry James Potter, account holder, minor. The claim incorporates related grievances under the doctrine of intertwined harm. He looked at Tony. The complainant will present the primary evidence. Tony stepped forward to the center of the floor. He set the device on the evidence stand, a flat stone platform at the center of the room that was clearly designed for magical evidence presentation but was going to have to accommodate Muggle technology, which Sharp Fong had handled by running an enchantment over the display surface that translated the screen output into a hovering projection visible to the whole chamber. He'd tested this twice. It worked. He looked up at the chamber. "I'm going to keep this simple," he said. "Because it is simple." He tapped the device and the first projection appeared above the evidence stand, the ledger data, rendered as a timeline, each quarterly transfer marked as a point of light. 36 transfers, Tony said. Quarterly, starting November 1981. Each one routed from the Potter Estate Trust through an administrative expense account to a private account registered to Albus Dumbledore. The transfers range from 41,000 to 83,000 galleons each. Total, 2,147,812 galleons. He let the number sit. The chamber murmured. "These are not disputed numbers," Tony said. "The Goblin Tribunal has independently verified every transaction against the original Gringotts records, which are immutable. This is not my data or my interpretation. It is the bank's own records presented through the bank's own legal process." He looked at Dumbledore. "Is the financial data disputed?" Dumbledore had counsel, a ministry solicitor named Horatio Fitch, who was very senior and very polished and had spent the last 30 days preparing a defense that Tony had been, with Clefjaw's assistance, systematically anticipating. Fitch stood and said, "The respondent does not dispute the existence of the transactions. The respondent's position is that the transactions were legitimately authorized under the guardianship provisions of the authorization documentation," Tony said. Fitch paused. "The Kashtarik filing requested the authorization documentation for all 36 transactions 12 days ago," Tony said. "Goblin law requires that a trustee maintain authorization records for every transaction made on behalf of a minor estate account. The filing requested those records." He looked at the chamber. 36 transactions. The respondent provided authorization documentation for, he tapped the device, none. The murmur in the chamber got significantly louder. Ogden raised his hand for quiet. Fitch said, "The respondent maintains that the authorization was inherent in the guardianship designation itself, which granted broad administrative authority, the guardianship designation," Tony said, and moved to the second slide. This was the one he'd spent the most time building. The timeline of November 1981, laid out in sequence with every document source cited. November 1, 1981, Tony said. James and Lily Potter are killed. At this point, the designated guardian for Harry Potter is Sirius Orion Black, designated in a document filed with Gringotts in July 1981, certified and on record. He pointed to the document citation. November 2. Sirius Black is arrested by Senior Auror Bartemius Crouch under emergency wartime detention provisions. November 3, one day after the arrest, a second person makes an emergency inquiry at Gringotts regarding the Potter estate. That person is Albus Dumbledore. He tapped the screen. November 5. Dumbledore files the guardianship default determination, placing Harry Potter with Vernon and Petunia Desley of Little Whinging, Surrey, under his authority as Chief Warlock. November 7. Dumbledore files his trustee designation for the Potter estate. November 10, 9 days after the arrest, Sirius Black is transferred to Azkaban. He paused. In the period between his arrest and his transfer to Azkaban, Tony said, there was no hearing. No Wisengamot proceeding. No evidence presented. No defense counsel appointed. No trial. He looked up at the chamber. The Goblin Legal Records request, submitted under Kashtaric authority, formally demanded the complete criminal proceedings documentation from the Ministry Department of Magical Law Enforcement for the case of Sirius Black, November 1981. The Ministry's response, received within the 7-day mandatory window, is in your evidence packages. He gave it a beat. The response stated that no trial proceedings documentation exists for this case, Tony said, because no trial proceedings occurred. The chamber erupted. Ogden's hand went up again, and this time he had to use his wand, which produced a sound like a gong that silenced the room with the efficiency of something that had been specifically designed for exactly this kind of situation. Tony waited. Sirius Black, he continued, when the chamber was quiet, was put in Azkaban for life without a trial. Within the same 10-day window in which the man who had been designated to raise Harry Potter was removed, and Albus Dumbledore stepped in as both guardianship authority and financial trustee. He looked at Dumbledore again. The doctrine of intertwined harm requires me to ask whether these events are connected. And I believe the evidence speaks clearly. But I want to be precise about what I am and am not claiming. Fitch was already on his feet. The complainant is making extraordinary accusations. I'm presenting documented facts, Tony said, with the perfect pleasantness of someone who has been waiting for this moment. The accusations, if they exist, are in the facts themselves. I'm just reading them out loud. He turned back to the chamber. I am not claiming that Dumbledore fabricated the evidence against Sirius Black. I am not claiming he arranged the arrest. I am claiming, with documentation, that he knew Sirius Black was in custody, that he knew no trial had been scheduled, that as Chief Warlock he had both the authority and the obligation to ensure that a man facing a life sentence received a hearing, and that he did not do so. Tony paused. And that the direct consequence of that inaction was that the designated guardian of Harry Potter was permanently removed, leaving Dumbledore as the only available authority over Harry Potter's life and estate. The chamber was completely silent. Tony let it be silent. He looked at Minerva McGonagall in the third tier. Her hands were still folded on the railing. Her face was still controlled. But her knuckles were white, which was the only thing showing, and that was enough. The financial mismanagement, Tony said, going back to the timeline, should be considered in this context. 2 million galleons taken from an orphan child's estate over 9 years, without documentation, without the child's knowledge, while the child lived in a residential cupboard. He looked up. I want this chamber to understand what I mean by residential cupboard. Harry Potter slept in a storage space under a staircase in his aunt's house. There were locks on the outside of the door. The space was 4 feet wide and 6 feet long and had no window. He stopped. He let the chamber see Harry. Harry was standing still, looking forward, not performing anything. He was just present. He didn't look like someone asking for sympathy. He looked like someone who had decided that the truth was enough and didn't need to be dressed up. The silence in the chamber had a specific quality now. Tony had sat in enough of his father's meetings to know what it felt like when a room shifted, when the weight of collected opinion moved in a direction that couldn't be walked back. It felt like that now. The Goblin Tribunal, Tony said, has made 4 determinations. First, the financial transfers represent a breach of fiduciary duty under Goblin Trust law, with no valid authorization and no documented justification. Second, the guardianship placement was made without adequate investigation of available alternatives, specifically failing to consider Remus Lupin, who was disqualified by a ministry provision but not by the wishes of the account holder's parents. Third, the failure to advocate for a hearing for Sirius Black, by the individual who had both the authority and the standing to do so, constitutes a material harm connected to the financial mismanagement under the doctrine of intertwined harm. Fourth, he tapped the device. The 4th finding appeared on the projection. The Goblin Tribunal finds that Sirius Orion Black has been imprisoned for 11 years without legal process, that the absence of legal process cannot now be retroactively legitimized, and that under the Treaty of 1752, the Goblin Banking Authority hereby formally petitions the Wisengamot to convene an emergency hearing on the matter of Sirius Black's continued detention. Fitch was on his feet and speaking, and 3 Wisengamot members were speaking, and the chamber was loud in the way that large rooms with very good acoustics are loud. Ogden was using the gong again. Tony stood in the center of the floor and waited. He was not nervous. He had the specific quality of stillness that came from having done every piece of preparation he could think of and then thought of more and done those too. He had read the law. He had verified the documents. He had anticipated the counterarguments and built responses that were grounded entirely in the immutable goblin records that could not be altered or disputed. He was 10 years old and he was standing on the floor of the oldest judicial chamber in the British wizarding world and he was completely fine. Harry leaned over slightly and said, quietly, "How are you this calm?" "I'm not calm," Tony said. "I'm accurate." "Different thing." When the chamber settled again, Dumbledore spoke for the first time. He didn't wait for Fitch. He stood up himself, and the quality of his standing was such that the room went quiet before he'd said a word, which Tony logged as the most precise demonstration of authority he'd seen in this world. No one told the room to be quiet. The room chose to be quiet because Dumbledore had stood up, which meant the room's default was to wait for what Dumbledore said. Tony had thought about this. He'd thought about how to handle this exact moment, because this was the moment that mattered. Not the evidence was clean and it spoke for itself. But Dumbledore responding was the moment where it could all shift sideways if Tony wasn't paying close attention. "I owe this chamber," Dumbledore said, "and more importantly I owe Harry, an explanation." He was looking at Harry when he said it. His voice was exactly what it looked like it would be, measured, warm, with the careful weight of someone who was used to carrying difficult things with grace. "The financial transfers," Dumbledore said, "were made in the genuine belief that they constituted legitimate administrative management of the Potter estate. I had authority as trustee, and I exercised that authority in what I believed to be the best interests of the trust. I acknowledge that the documentation standard was not met, and I accept that this was a serious failure of process." He paused. "I also accept that the placement of Harry with his aunt and uncle was a decision that I made unilaterally, without the consultation that such a significant decision required, and that the conditions of that placement were," his voice shifted microscopically, "not what I had intended, and not what I would have permitted had I known." He looked at Tony now. "Regarding Sirius Black," he said, "I made an assumption. In the days following the events of November 1st, I had every reason to believe that Sirius Black was responsible for the deaths of James and Lily Potter, and for the deaths of 12 Muggles, and for the betrayal of their location to Voldemort. I acted on that belief. I did not advocate for a trial." He paused. "That was wrong. If my assumption was incorrect, and I must now concede that it may have been, given the absence of any formal evidentiary record, then the consequences of that wrong are very grave, and I bear responsibility for them." He sat down. The chamber was very, very quiet. Tony had anticipated a defense. He'd anticipated Fitch and procedural objections and technical arguments about authorization provisions. He'd anticipated resistance. What he hadn't anticipated was this: the clean, dignified, publicly offered acknowledgement of error, delivered in Dumbledore's particular voice, which had the quality of making everything it touched feel considered and sorrowful and almost forgivable. He understood, in that moment, exactly why people trusted this man. He also understood that what Dumbledore had just done was very carefully separate his intent from the outcome, put the weight on his own shoulders in a way that was visible and controlled, and position himself as someone who had made mistakes in good faith, which was the strongest possible ground to stand on. Tony looked at him for a long moment. Then he picked up the device. "The respondent has acknowledged the breach of fiduciary duty," Tony said. "The respondent has acknowledged the inadequate guardianship investigation. The respondent has acknowledged the failure to advocate for a hearing for Sirius Black." He paused. "I'd like to add one thing to the record." He tapped the device. A new projection appeared. It was a simpler document, a single page, clean and straightforward. Tony had found it in the second week, in a cross-reference he'd almost skipped. This is a communication from the office of Albus Dumbledore to the Department of Magical Law Enforcement, dated November the 8th, 1981, Tony said. 2 days before Sirius Black's transfer to Azkaban. He read from the document. In the matter of the detained individual Sirius Black, I advise against any delay of transfer proceedings. The case is sufficiently clear and further process would serve only to prolong public uncertainty during an already difficult period. Proceed as planned. Signed, Albus Dumbledore, Chief Warlock. The chamber was absolutely still. Tony looked up. You didn't fail to advocate for a trial, Tony said, directly to Dumbledore. You actively advised against the delay that would have allowed one to happen. Dumbledore looked at him. For the first time since the session had started, the warm and steady quality of his expression shifted. Not into guilt, into something more complex than guilt. Into the expression of someone who has been carrying a version of a story for so long that the revision arrives like something physical. I believed he was guilty, Dumbledore said. Quietly. To Tony, not to the chamber. I know, Tony said. That's in the document. You believed he was guilty and you decided the process was unnecessary because the outcome was obvious. He held the projection steady. But the process isn't there because the outcome is uncertain. The process is there because even when the outcome seems obvious, you don't get to skip it. Because sometimes the obvious answer is wrong. He paused. And this time it was. Fitch was on his feet again and speaking, and 3 Wizengamot members were speaking again, but this time the quality of the noise was different. This time the room was not angry at the challenge to Dumbledore. The room was angry at the document. Ogden used the gong. This chamber, he said, when silence returned, will note the document for the record. Given what has been presented today, I am calling a procedural recess to consult with the Wizengamot members before any determination is made. He looked at Tony, then at Harry, then at Dumbledore. This session will reconvene in 1 hour. The chamber broke into movement. People stood, leaned together, spoke in urgent quiet voices. Tony watched McGonagall stand and make her way down from the 3rd tier and across the floor, and he watched her stop in front of Dumbledore's seat, and he watched the exchange that happened between them. He couldn't hear it from here. But McGonagall's voice, whatever it was saying, was very precisely contained, and Dumbledore's response was brief, and when she turned away her expression was not angry, it was something quieter and more lasting than angry, which Tony thought was probably the appropriate response to finding out that someone you trusted completely for 40 years had let a man rot in prison to protect a plan. Harry appeared at Tony's shoulder. That letter, Harry said. The one you found. You didn't tell me about that one. I found it 4 days ago, Tony said. I wanted to present it here, in public, where it would have maximum impact. Harry was quiet for a moment. Maximum impact on who? Everyone who was already inclined to forgive him because he acknowledged the mistakes, Tony said. The acknowledgement was real, I believe that, I think he genuinely regrets the outcome. But regret doesn't mean it was unintentional. That letter means it wasn't a passive failure. It was an active decision. He looked at Harry. People needed to see the distinction. Harry looked at the document still hovering over the evidence stand. He believed Sirius was guilty, Harry said. Yes. And he still might be. We still don't actually know. We know there was no trial, Tony said. We know the evidence was never tested. We know that you're owed a process, and Sirius Black is owed a process, and the process is what we're here to get. He looked at Harry. What happens after that, that's up to what the process finds. Harry nodded slowly. The recess lasted 47 minutes instead of 60. When the chamber reconvened, Ogden's expression had the settled quality of someone who had had a conversation that resolved something that had been open for a long time. This chamber, he said, in light of the evidence presented and the tribunal findings of the Gringotts Banking Authority, makes the following determinations. He read from a parchment that was clearly newly written. First, The breach of fiduciary duty in the matter of the Potter Estate Trust is upheld. Full restitution of misappropriated funds, plus interest calculated at the goblin standard rate, is to be made to the Potter estate within 30 days. Second, the guardianship placement of Harry Potter is hereby formally reviewed, and a proper guardianship hearing is to be convened within 2 weeks with full consideration of all available qualified guardians. Third, an emergency hearing for Sirius Orion Black is to be convened before this chamber within 72 hours, with full examination of available evidence. Fourth, the conduct of Albus Dumbledore in the matter of the Black detention communication is to be referred to a formal Wisengamot inquiry, to be convened within 30 days. He set the parchment down. Does the complainant find these determinations satisfactory? Tony looked at Ironhook. Ironhook gave the smallest possible nod. Tony looked at Harry. Harry said, yes. The respondent? Fitch was on his feet with objections to the inquiry referral specifically, which Tony had expected, and the procedural argument took another 12 minutes to resolve, but it resolved the same way. The inquiry referral stood, with modified scope, which Cleftjaw had anticipated and given Tony the language to accept without conceding anything material. When the session closed and the chamber began to empty, Tony stood on the central floor for a moment and let his brain stop running at the speed it had been running at for the last hour. It ran at a lower speed. Not slow, Tony didn't have a slow setting, but lower. Calibrating back to baseline. He looked at the evidence stand where the projection was fading. 2,147,812 galleons, plus interest, going back to Harry. An emergency hearing for Sirius Black in 72 hours. A formal inquiry into Dumbledore. Not everything. Not final. But the machinery was in motion and the records were real and the process was happening and nobody could quietly make any of it go away. Ironhook stepped up beside him. The Goblin Tribunal is satisfied with the proceedings, Ironhook said. Yeah. Tony said. You read Chapter 12, Section 2, Ironhook said. I read the whole thing, Tony said. I know, Ironhook said, and there was something in it that Tony recognized after a moment as the Goblin equivalent of a compliment, which was a thing Ironhook distributed the way other people distributed extremely rare currency. The Kashtarik, Tony said. Once the restitution is complete, is the proceeding formally closed? The financial component is closed, Ironhook said. The inquiry component continues independently through the Wisengamot. And the guardianship hearing? 2 weeks. The primary candidate, given the legal standing research your documentation established, is, Ironhook paused, contingent on the outcome of the Black hearing in 72 hours. Tony looked at him. He might not be innocent, Tony said. The same thing he'd said to Harry. Keeping it honest. He might not be, Ironhook agreed. But he will have a trial. And the trial will produce a record. And the record will be what it is. He folded his hands. That is all that can be guaranteed. The rest depends on the facts. Tony looked across the emptying chamber to where Harry was standing with Griphook, not talking, looking at the high-backed seats in the upper tier that were now empty. He looked small in the big stone space, still small, still in the new robes, still with the straight glasses and the dark hair that wouldn't comb flat, but he held the space differently than he'd held the Privet Drive garden. There was something upright in him now that hadn't been there 30 days ago. It wasn't confidence exactly. It was something more basic. Like a person taking up the space that was actually theirs to take up, for the first time. Dumbledore passed through the chamber on his way out. He had to pass within 10 feet of Tony and Harry, and he stopped. Not Fitch, not an aide, Dumbledore himself. He stopped and he looked at Harry. Harry, he said. Harry looked at him. I did what I believed was right, Dumbledore said. I need you to know that. Everything I did, I believed it was necessary. I know, Harry said. And I am sorry, Dumbledore said. For the placement. For the funds. For Sirius, if, he stopped. For all of it. Harry looked at him for a long moment. I know, he said again. And then, that's not enough. Dumbledore held his gaze. No, he said quietly. I don't suppose it is. He moved on. Tony watched him go and didn't say anything. Harry stood there for a moment. Was that, Harry started. Real? Tony said. Yeah. I think so. It doesn't change anything. No, Tony agreed. It doesn't. Harry turned away from the door Dumbledore had gone through. 72 hours, he said. 72 hours, Tony said. And then we find out. McGonagall appeared at the edge of the floor, moving with purpose, and stopped in front of them both with the expression of someone who had made a decision and was now acting on it with full commitment. Mr. Potter, she said. She looked at Tony. And you? Tony Stark, Tony said. I know who you are, she said, which was interesting because they hadn't been introduced. I have been following this proceeding very closely. Her jaw was set and her eyes were bright and she was clearly managing something significant behind the composure. I want you to know, both of you, that I was not aware of the financial situation, of the conditions at your aunt's house, she stopped. I was not aware. I know, Harry said. She looked at him. You should have been, Harry said. Not cruelly. Just with the direct accuracy of someone who had learned to say true things without softening them unnecessarily. McGonagall's expression moved through several things quickly. Yes, she said. I should have been. She held Harry's gaze. I intend to correct that, going forward. If you'll allow it. Harry looked at her. We'll see, he said, and Tony thought that for 11 years old, coming from where he was coming from, that was both exactly right and more grace than most people would have managed. McGonagall nodded once, sharply, like something agreed to. She left. Tony looked at the empty chamber. At the stone and the dark wood and the torchlight on the old walls. At the evidence stand where the projection had fully faded now, just a flat stone surface with no record of what had been shown on it, except in the minds of everyone who'd been in the room. Tony, Harry said. Yeah. Thank you, Harry said. I already said that. But, today specifically. Thank you. Tony picked up the device from the evidence stand. 72 hours, he said. Save the thanks for after. But he noted, smiling. Chapter 6, Reactor. The emergency hearing for Sirius Black began at 9 in the morning on a Thursday, and by 9:10 it had already become the most attended Wisengamot session in 40 years. People had heard. That was the thing about public proceedings in a world that ran on word of mouth and owl post. The information moved fast and sideways, and by the time Tony and Harry arrived at the Ministry atrium, there were witches and wizards standing in the corridors who had no official reason to be there and every unofficial one. They'd heard about the Kashtarik. They'd heard about the letter. They'd heard that Dumbledore had been referred to a formal inquiry and that a man who'd been in Azkaban for 11 years was about to get the hearing he'd never had. They wanted to see. Tony didn't blame them. He'd have wanted to see too. The atrium was all golden statues and polished floors, and it should have felt grand but mostly felt like the lobby of a bank that was trying too hard, and Tony walked through it next to Harry and noted that people looked at Harry with an expression he was beginning to understand was complicated by Harry's history in this world, the boy who lived, the child who'd survived something that nobody else had, who had grown up in the collective imagination as a symbol of something before he'd grown up at all. Harry didn't notice. Or rather, he noticed and did what he always did with things that required a response he hadn't figured out yet, filed them and kept moving. Sharpfong was waiting at the entrance to the hearing chamber with Cleftjaw, both of them with the particular crispness of goblins who had prepared thoroughly and expected the preparation to be adequate. Griphook was with them, which was unnecessary from a security standpoint but which Tony had gotten used to over the past month and now found oddly reassuring. The prisoner is being transported from Azkaban this morning, Sharpfong said. He will arrive before the session opens. There will be Dementors escorting the transport. Keep them out of the chamber, Tony said. That was already arranged. Good. Tony looked at the chamber doors. Who else is presenting? The ministry has assigned an auror named Kingsley Shacklebolt to review the arrest documentation and provide testimony on the evidence as it exists. Sharpfong glanced at a parchment. There is no prosecution counsel because there was never a prosecution proceeding. The ministry's position is currently, she paused, in the way of someone reading something they find procedurally unusual, that they are presenting as a neutral party pending the hearing outcome. They're hedging, Tony said. Yes, Sharpfong said, without inflection. Harry was quiet beside Tony, which was different from his usual quiet. His usual quiet was active, processing, cataloging, building. This was a held-breath quality. Like someone waiting for something they'd been waiting for without knowing it. Tony didn't say anything about it. They went in. The chamber had the same dark stone and tiered seating, but it was configured differently from the Kashtaric hearing, more like a trial space, with a chair in the center that had chains on the armrests, which Tony stared at for a moment because they were genuinely and literally restraint chains on a piece of courtroom furniture, and that was either standard procedure or something very specific to very serious cases, and either way it was medieval. The chains were still. The chair was empty. They sat in the front row of the observers' gallery, which Ironhook had arranged. The gallery was filling fast, and the Wisingamot tiered seats were filling faster, and the murmur in the room had a different texture than the Kashtaric hearing, tighter, more anticipatory. At 9:17, Sirius Black arrived. Tony had been building a picture of him too, for 30 days, from documents and timelines and a set of facts that didn't quite resolve into a coherent person. The financial designation. The emergency inquiry. The arrest record. The 11 years in Azkaban, which Tony had read enough about to understand was not simply imprisonment. Azkaban was staffed by Dementors, creatures that fed on positive emotion, which meant 11 years there was 11 years of having happiness progressively removed from you. He was prepared for the physical version to be bad. He was not fully prepared. Sirius Black was escorted in by 2 aurors, and he walked on his own, which Tony registered as significant because 11 years in Azkaban and he walked on his own. He was thin in the way that wasn't just thin. It was the thinness of someone for whom the experience of having a body had been systematically reduced over a long period. His hair was long and unwashed, his robes were the prison-issue gray, and his face was the face of a man who had been somewhere terrible for a very long time and knew exactly where he was and exactly what was happening and was holding on to that knowledge with everything he had. His eyes were dark gray and very clear. That was the thing. Whatever else 11 years in Azkaban had done to him, his eyes were clear. He was present. He was in the room in a way that suggested the room was remarkable to him, the stone walls, the torchlight, the faces, the air that wasn't Azkaban air, and that he was taking it in with the fierce attention of someone who wasn't sure how long it would last. The aurors brought him to the chair. He sat. The chains moved, and Tony tensed, but they only settled around the armrests without engaging, a precaution that was apparently standard for serious charges, not activated unless there was a specific security concern during the hearing. Sirius Black looked at the chains and then looked up at the room with the expression of someone who had already processed the worst version of this scenario and was operating from the position that whatever happened next was better than what had already happened. He looked around the gallery. His eyes found Harry. Tony watched it happen. Watched the moment when Sirius Black found the face that was James Potter's hair and Lily Potter's eyes in a boy who was 11 years old and hadn't existed for him in any real way since he was a year old, and then he'd been in Azkaban and there had been nothing. Sirius Black stopped moving. Harry was very still. They looked at each other across the courtroom and Tony didn't look away because he was watching something that was both private and important and he was a witness to it whether it was convenient or not. Sirius Black's expression was, it went through about 7 things in 4 seconds, none of which Tony could fully name, and then it settled into something that was equal parts grief and ferocity and something so raw it was almost physical. Harry's expression settled into something Tony had not seen on him before. Something that was not cautious, was not controlled, was not the careful blankness. It was simpler than all of those. It was recognition. The recognition of someone meeting a face that should have been in their life all along and recognizing its absence as loss for the first time. Harry didn't look away. Sirius Black didn't look away. Ogden called the session to order. The proceeding was different from what Tony was used to running. This wasn't his evidence to present, the financial documentation was already in the record, and the no-trial argument had already been made and accepted in principle. This was the evidentiary hearing that should have happened in November 1981, happening now, with the original evidence presented for the first time. Auror Kingsley Shacklebolt was a tall man with a calm, deliberate way of speaking that Tony respected immediately. He was the kind of person who said what he'd found and didn't editorialize, which Tony thought was a rare and underrated quality. Shacklebolt presented the arrest documentation and then said, "In reviewing the case file for these proceedings, I found several significant gaps in the original investigation. Specifically, no wand testing was performed on the defendant's wand before or after his imprisonment. No forensic examination of the crime scene at Godric's Hollow or the incident site in the Muggle Street was conducted with any formal documentation. No witness statements were taken under oath. Fitch, who was not present, Fitch had declined to represent Dumbledore in this proceeding, which Tony thought was telling, had been replaced by a ministry barrister who said, the emergency wartime provisions under which the defendant was detained did not require these steps. The provisions allowed detention without immediate trial, Shacklebolt said, with the patience of someone who had prepared for this. They did not preclude investigation. The investigation simply wasn't done. What was the charge? Ogden asked. Conspiracy to betray the Potter family to Voldemort, Shacklebolt said, and the murder of Peter Pettigrew and 12 Muggle bystanders. And the evidence for the murder charge? Shacklebolt paused. The evidence, he said, is that 13 people died at a location where Black and Pettigrew were known to have confronted each other. The physical evidence from the scene indicated a very large magical explosion. Pettigrew's body was never recovered, only a finger. The chamber murmured. A finger, Ogden said. One finger, Shacklebolt confirmed. That was the entirety of the physical remains attributed to Pettigrew. The Muggle deaths were caused by the explosion, and no forensic magical analysis was conducted to determine whose spell or spells generated it. Tony sat forward slightly. A finger. One finger, no body, no wand testing, no forensic analysis. He looked at the device on his knee and the notes he'd been building across the last 30 days, and he followed the thread he'd started pulling 2 weeks ago when the Pettigrew documentation had come through the Goblin Records request and something had caught at the edge of his attention and wouldn't let go. He leaned across to Iron Hook, who was seated to his left. The Pettigrew report, Tony said, very quietly. The one bitter stone found in the secondary estate files. Page 4. Ironhook reached into the case file and found the document without looking down, which meant he'd been expecting this moment. Tony took it, read it, and stood up. Ogden looked at him. The observer gallery does not have speaking rights in this proceeding. I have evidence relevant to the current testimony, Tony said. Under Article 14 of the Wisengamot Charter, any individual with documentary evidence directly material to an active hearing may petition to introduce it. A pause. You've memorized our charter, Ogden said. The relevant sections, Tony said pleasantly. Another pause. Ogden looked at the ministry barrister, who looked at his own notes and said, with the expression of someone confirming something they wished they couldn't confirm, Article 14 does exist, sir. Introduce the document, Ogden said, in the tone of someone who had stopped being surprised. Tony walked to the evidence stand. Peter Pettigrew, he said, was a registered animagus. He set the document on the stand and projected it. This is a registration document from the Gringotts Secondary Estate Archive, cross-referenced in the Potter Family Trust records. Pettigrew registered with the Potter account as a trusted associate in 1979, and the registration included his animagus form as a standard security notation. He looked at the chamber. His form was a rat. Silence. A very small animal, Tony continued, capable of surviving an explosion that would kill a human being, especially if that explosion was generated by said animal's own wand. A small animal that could lose a single finger, or rather, a single toe, in the process of transformation and escape while everyone present assumed it was dead. He let that sit. The physical evidence at the scene, one finger, no body, is consistent with a staged death by an animagus who wanted to disappear. The chamber was completely still. Shacklebolt was looking at the document with an expression that was very focused and very still in the specific way of a professional who is rapidly reassembling a picture they'd already considered complete. If Pettigrew staged his death, Shacklebolt said, not to Tony but to the room, following the logic aloud, and if Pettigrew was the actual secret keeper for the Potters, then Sirius Black couldn't have betrayed them, Tony said, because he wasn't the secret keeper. The noise in the chamber was significant and immediate. Tony looked at Sirius Black. Sirius Black was gripping the armrests of the chair. The chains had still not engaged. His knuckles were white and his jaw was tight and his clear gray eyes were, not surprised, Tony realized. Not surprised at all. Because he'd known. He'd known for 11 years in Azkaban, and he'd had nobody to tell, and there had been no trial, and the knowledge had sat in him for 11 years like something burning. Tony looked at him for a moment. Sirius Black looked back. Can you confirm, Tony said, for the record, who was the secret keeper for the Fidelius charm on the Potter house at Godric's Hollow? The chamber went completely silent. Every face turned to Sirius Black in the chair. Sirius Black sat up straighter. Whatever 11 years in Azkaban had done to his body, it hadn't touched the quality of how he held himself when it mattered. Peter Pettigrew, he said. His voice was rough from disuse but it was clear and it was absolutely certain. James changed the plan at the last minute. He thought I was too obvious, that I'd be the first target. He thought Peter was safer. I argued against it. I was wrong to agree. He paused. I went after Peter when I found out what he'd done. I found him in the street. I confronted him. He was the one who cast the curse, he blew up the street to cover his escape and framed me for it, and then he ran. His jaw tightened. He ran and he's been running ever since. As a rat, exactly like your document says. He's been hiding as a rat for 11 years. Complete silence. Then the chamber erupted, and this time Ogden used the gong 4 times. The proceedings took another 3 hours. Not because the evidence was complicated, the evidence was, once the animagus registration document was in the record, devastatingly clear, but because 11 years of legal inaction had to be procedurally addressed, and the ministry barrister had to formally concede the inadequacy of the original detention, and the question of finding Peter Pettigrew had to be formally handed to the Auror office, and Shacklebolt had to make a statement for the record that he would personally lead that investigation. But the fundamental thing happened at 12:47 in the afternoon, when Ogden looked at Sirius Black in the chair and said, "This chamber finds no sufficient evidence to support the charges against Sirius Oran Black, and further finds that the original detention was conducted without the legal process required under wizarding law. Sirius Oran Black is hereby released from custody, with immediate effect, and the charges against him are formally dismissed pending the full investigation into Peter Pettigrew." The chains on the armrests retracted. Sirius Black sat in the chair and looked at his own hands for a moment, and his face was doing things that Tony was not going to describe because they were private and deserved to be. Then he stood up. He was still thin, still in the grey prison robes, still carrying 11 years in every line of him, but he stood up, and he looked across the chamber at Harry, and Harry was already standing. They met in the middle of the floor. Tony watched from the evidence stand, device in hand, and did not say a word. Harry walked up to Sirius Black and Sirius Black looked down at him with those clear grey eyes, and said, "You look just like your dad." "Everyone says that," Harry said, and his voice was steady and his eyes were not. "He'd have been," Sirius Black stopped. He pressed his lips together. Started again. "He'd have been so proud of you." He looked at Tony briefly. Both of you. He's not mine, Harry said. I mean, he's from somewhere else. But he stopped and looked at Tony with an expression that Tony had no immediate category for. Tony held up the device. I have the documentation, he said. Sirius Black looked at him for a long moment. Ironhook told me you hacked Gringotts, Sirius said. In my defense, I was bored, Tony said. Sirius Black's face did the 7 things in 4 seconds routine again and then settled on something that was, unmistakably, a very tired and very genuine laugh. The guardianship hearing happened 8 days later. It was shorter than the Kashtaric and quieter than the Black hearing, and it was attended by Tony, Harry, Ironhook, Sharp Fong, McGonagall, who had submitted a formal statement supporting Harry's placement in a wizarding household, and Sirius Black, who had spent the 8 intervening days in a ministry-provided residence and had eaten consistently for what appeared to be the first time in 11 years and was slightly less skeletal about it. Remus Lupin was also there. Tony had found him in the 2nd week, living quietly in a small house in Wales, working as a translator, having no idea that any of this had been happening. He'd arrived at Gringotts 2 days after Tony's owl found him looking like a man who had been braced for bad news for so long that good news had become a foreign language. He was thin like Sirius was thin but differently, a sustained thinness, the thinness of a life lived carefully on insufficient resources, partly because he was a werewolf in a world that had specific opinions about werewolves and those opinions had professional consequences. He had brown hair going grey at the temples and kind eyes and a manner that was gentle without being soft, and he looked at Harry with a kind of careful, reverent attention. You've grown, Lupin said, which made no sense given that the last time he'd seen Harry was when Harry was 1, and they both knew it made no sense, and Harry almost smiled. My mum's letters are in the vault, Harry said. In the restricted family documents section. If you wanted to see them. Lupin pressed his lips together. Yes, he said. I would. The guardianship determination acknowledged the werewolf registry exclusion, which Tony had argued in the pre-hearing brief was applicable only as a disqualifier of primary guardianship under the specific ministry provision, and that the provision did not preclude designation as a secondary or co-guardian under the broader family standing framework. The brief had taken him 2 days and referenced 6 separate legal precedents that Bitterstone had helped him locate, and Cleftjaw had read it and said nothing at all for almost 30 seconds, which Tony had learned to interpret as the highest possible form of goblin professional approval. Sirius Black was named primary guardian. The Wisingamot hearing on the guardianship was brief and didn't require a vote. The original default placement under Dumbledore's chief warlock authority had been voided by the inquiry, and with Sirius Black's charges dismissed, his designation as guardian under the original 1981 documentation was simply reinstated. Harry was given the paperwork to review. He read all of it. Every page. Then he signed it. And that was that. Dumbledore's formal inquiry was ongoing and would be for some time. The financial restitution was being processed, the inquiry scope included the Black detention letter and the guardianship determination, and there was a separate ministry investigation into Bartemius Crouch's use of emergency detention authority that had been triggered by the no-trial documentation. Tony was not involved in any of that directly anymore. He'd built the case and handed it to the machinery, and the machinery was doing its work. Dumbledore had issued a public statement through his solicitor acknowledging the financial breach and the guardianship failures and expressing deep personal regret. Tony had read it. It was, as he'd expected, dignified and sorrowful and completely sincere in the way of someone who had never stopped believing in his own good intentions even while accounting for the specific harm they'd caused. Tony found, on reflection, that he didn't hate him. He found Dumbledore genuinely disturbing in a way that was more interesting and more uncomfortable than hatred, a demonstration of what happened when someone was smart enough to construct a complete internal justification for anything and powerful enough that nobody challenged the construction for 50 years. But hatred required a certain kind of simplicity, and Albus Dumbledore was not simple. Harry, when Tony had said something like this, had been quiet for a long time and then said, "I think I understand him. I just don't forgive him." "Not yet." "You don't have to," Tony said. "I know," Harry said. "That's why I might eventually." Tony had written that down. Not on the device, just in his head, in the part where he kept things that didn't fit existing categories. The question of Tony going home had been present for the whole 30 days in the way of something you don't look directly at when you're busy, and now it was September and Hogwarts letters were real and Harry was going in 3 weeks and the case was resolved and Tony had been in this world for over a month. He sat in the Gringotts Law Library on a Tuesday afternoon with the device and the goblin translation indices and what amounted to 30 days of notes on the enchantment carrier wave architecture he'd mapped in the first 2 days, and he thought about the resonance prototype and what he knew about dimensional displacement and what he'd learned about the way magical current and electromagnetic signal interfaced. He had a theory. The theory was that the accident that had brought him here had opened a displacement channel, a specific resonance frequency between the two-dimensional states, and that channels, once opened, could theoretically be reopened from either end if you knew the frequency. Which Tony now knew, because he'd mapped it when he was accessing the Gringotts system and had noted, in the back of his mind, that the carrier wave frequency had a very specific signature that was distinct from any known electromagnetic bandwidth. The signature was in his notes. He could build a device to generate that frequency. He could go home. He sat with that for a while. Home was Howard Stark's lab and Howard Stark's do not touch notes in a world where magic didn't exist and the most interesting problem available was the one he'd been trying to solve before the prototype went off. Home was New York in 1990 and a house that was technically full of people and practically empty in every way that mattered. He looked at the notes. He thought about Harry, who now had a godfather and a vault and a guardianship certificate and a Hogwarts letter on his dresser. He thought about Sirius Black eating consistently and sleeping in a house with doors that locked from the inside. He thought about Lupin in Wales reading Lily Potter's letters. He thought about McGonagall's formal statement, which he'd read, which had been precise and unsentimental and had contained between its lines a quality of recalibration that Tony thought boded well for her as a person going forward. He thought about Iron Hook, who had spent 114 years doing his job and had spent the last month doing something different, and who had said, the morning after the Kashtarik hearing, with the expression of someone making an institutional note, the Goblin security architecture has several additional vulnerabilities that your access method could theoretically be used to exploit. Given that you identified them, it would be reasonable to request your assessment. Tony had spent 4 days writing the security assessment. It was thorough. It was also, embedded in the enchantment layer recommendations, a very small, very elegant piece of code that ran on the electromagnetic magical interface he'd mapped, a passive monitoring layer that would flag anomalous access attempts using the same method he'd used, running quietly in the background of the system's third tier, invisible to standard security sweeps, drawing so little current that it wouldn't register on any active diagnostic. He'd told Iron Hook about it. You embedded something in our system, Iron Hook had said. With your knowledge, Tony said. That's different. What does it do? Watches for anyone trying what I tried, Tony said. And logs the attempt without alerting the person making it, so you can observe and respond rather than just blocking. It's a defensive tool. Iron Hook had looked at him for a long time. The access credentials to review the log, Iron Hook said, would need to be held by a trusted individual. Agreed, Tony said. Someone who understands both Muggle technology and Goblin enchantment architecture. Those are fairly specific qualifications, Tony said. They are, Iron Hook said. You'll need to write down the access protocol before you leave. Tony had written it down and given it to Sharpfong, who had given it to the restricted archive with his name on the file, which meant there was now a small piece of Tony Stark embedded permanently in the Gringotts security architecture. He thought that was funny. He thought Howard Stark, who had built things in every city he'd ever been to because Howard couldn't help leaving a mark either, might have also found it funny, in a parallel where Howard thought anything Tony did was worth noticing. He built the resonance device in 3 days using components from Muggle electronics shops in London, nothing magical, because the device needed to work on the electromagnetic end of the interface, and magic would only complicate the frequency calibration. The hardest part wasn't the build, which was actually quite elegant once he had the theory properly structured. The hardest part was the calibration, which required knowing his point of origin with sufficient precision. He had the coordinates. He'd calculated them from the timing and the displacement vector on the first day, when he'd been sitting in Aldous Pembridge's office eating biscuits and waiting for someone to figure out what to do with him. He'd been sitting there calculating his dimensional displacement because he was 10 years old and it was more interesting than the biscuits. The device was the size of a large book. It was not elegant by his usual standards, he'd had to work with what was available, but it was functional, and function was what mattered. He sat in the law library the day before he was going to test it and looked at the device and looked at his notes and thought about whether he was leaving anything undone. The answer was no. Everything that needed doing had been done. The answer was also, separately, that he was going to miss this place, which was strange because it wasn't his place and had never been supposed to be. He was going to miss the law library specifically, which was quiet and smelled like old leather and had that particular held-breath silence. He was going to miss Ironhook's company, which was sparse and acerbic and entirely without pretension. He was going to miss Griphook's newspaper, which he'd never once seen Griphook actually read but which Griphook carried everywhere and occasionally made notes in the margins of. He was going to miss Harry. He went to say goodbye. Harry was at number 12, Grimmauld Place, which was where Sirius had grown up and which had been in the Black family and was now technically Harry's. In the complicated legal way of old wizarding estates, it was held in a shared trust between Harry and Sirius as co-inheritors of the Black family estate, which Bitterstone had spent 3 days untangling and which Tony had read in full because he was Tony and couldn't not. The house was enormous and somewhat terrifying and had a portrait of Sirius's mother in the hallway that screamed when it was uncovered, which Sirius had dealt with by covering it with a curtain and nailing the curtain to the wall. It smelled like old wood and history and, increasingly, like actual food, because Sirius had decided that cooking was a skill he was going to acquire with the specific focus of someone who had spent 11 years eating Azkaban rations. He was currently terrible at it. The kitchen showed evidence of at least 3 recent culinary attempts of varying catastrophic scope. Harry was eating cereal. Tony sat at the kitchen table and Harry poured him a bowl of cereal without asking, which Tony appreciated enormously because it was the gesture of someone who had categorized him as a person who ate cereal in their kitchen and was acting accordingly. "You're leaving tomorrow," Harry said. "Not a question." "Testing the device tomorrow," Tony said. "If it works, then yes. And if it doesn't work? Then I recalibrate and try again." Tony looked at the cereal. "I'll get home eventually." "Eventually," Harry said, and his voice was neutral in the way that meant he was managing something. "Hey," Tony said. Harry looked at him. "You have everything you need," Tony said. "Sirius is here. Lupin's coming for dinner twice a week. The money is sorted. The guardianship is legal and documented. McGonagall is invested in your first year at Hogwarts in a way that I think is going to surprise you." He paused. "You have everything." "I know," Harry said. "But..." Harry looked at his cereal for a moment. "You were the first person who did something," Harry said. "Not because they were supposed to, not because I was, because of what I survived or whatever. Just because you looked at the numbers and thought it was wrong and fixed it." He paused. "You didn't even know me." "I didn't need to know you," Tony said. "The numbers were wrong." Harry stopped. "That's such a you answer. Is it inaccurate?" "No," Harry said. He looked at Tony directly. "But the reason I trust the outcome is because I trust you. Not just the numbers." Tony sat with that for a moment. "You'll be okay," he said finally. "I know," Harry said. "I know you know. I'm saying it anyway." Sirius appeared in the kitchen doorway in a state of minor culinary disaster, holding a pan that was emitting small amounts of smoke. "I think the bacon is done," he said. "Or done in. I'm not entirely sure which." "Both," Harry said, with the manner of someone who had already eaten the cereal in anticipation of this outcome. Tony looked at them, Sirius Black, 11 years out of Azkaban and still learning how to do ordinary things, and Harry Potter, 11 years old and eating cereal in a kitchen that was his, in a house that was his, with someone who should have been with him all along, and he thought that it was good. It was not a perfect outcome. Dumbledore was still in process, Pettigrew was still missing, the Wisengamot inquiry was still running, and there were probably 17 things he hadn't fully anticipated that were going to become relevant later. But the foundation was solid. The documents were real. The machinery was in motion. The people who should have been in Harry Potter's life were in Harry Potter's life. That was enough. He took the burned bacon that Sirius offered, because you didn't refuse burned bacon from someone who was currently finding out what cooking was, and he ate breakfast in the kitchen of a house that smelled like old wood and history in someone's very earnest attempt at food, and he let himself have the morning. The device worked. He'd set it up on the edge of the Gringotts' back courtyard, which Ironhook had made available without comment, and the calibration had taken 4 hours and 2 recalibrations, and when he triggered it, the air in front of him opened in a way that made his ears hurt and his eyes report information they didn't quite have the framework for, and on the other side was the smoking crater of Howard Stark's lab, exactly as he'd left it. The timestamp on the far side read 40 seconds after he'd been displaced. Time moved differently. Good to know. He stood at the threshold for a moment. Ironhook was behind him. The security assessment recommendations, Tony said. The third-tier restructuring specifically. Give it to your best enchantment architect, not the most senior one. Best and most senior aren't always the same. I know the difference, Ironhook said. I know you do. Tony turned around. Thank you. 4. The library. The audit. The transit. You gave us grounds to act on something we had been unable to act on, Ironhook said. The debt is not yours. I hacked your bank, Tony said. 7 minutes and 43 seconds, Ironhook said. I was going to bring it down to 6. I know, Ironhook said, and there was the thing again, that spare, acerbic quality that wasn't warmth but was something in the same family. Leave now, Stark. Before the channel closes. Tony picked up the device. He looked at the smoking crater through the opening, the familiar dimensions of his father's lab, the overturned workbench, the smell of ozone and burned components drifting through. He thought about Harry eating cereal. About Sirius and the bacon. About the law library and the not-quite tea and the Gringotts security log with his name on the file. He stepped through. The channel closed behind him with a sound like a very clean, very final click, which was something he'd heard before in a sealed document in a goblin bank and which felt, now, like punctuation. He was standing in his father's lab. The prototype was still smoldering. The workbench was still overturned. The sticky note that said "Do not touch" was still stuck to the remains of the device, mildly singed at the edge but legible. Tony looked at the note. He thought about 114 years and an immutable ledger in 7 minutes and 43 seconds and a kid in rope-belted hand-me-downs in a Surrey garden and a man with clear grey eyes standing up from a chair with chains on the armrests. He thought about what it felt like to look at something wrong and be unable to not fix it. He pulled the sticky note off the prototype. He turned it over. He took a pen from the workbench. He wrote on the back, "Fixed the resonance issue. Channel frequency, 17 digits. Displacement coordinates on back. The carrier wave logic is in the third component, you were running it wrong. Also your lab security is terrible." He left it on the workbench where Howard would find it. Then he sat down on the floor of the smoking lab, because there was nowhere else to sit, and he thought about everything that had happened in the last 30-some days, and how the device was going to need significant improvement if he ever wanted to use it reliably, and how there were probably 17 things in the other world that were going to need handling that he hadn't anticipated. He thought about whether Harry had written him, and realized there was no way for Harry to write him, and thought that he should probably figure out a cross-dimensional owl. He opened the device and started making notes. He'd been making notes for about 20 minutes when the lab door opened and Howard Stark came in and stopped and stared at the smoking crater and then stared at Tony. "What," Howard said, "happened?" "Your resonance calibration was 40 degrees off," Tony said. You were also running the prototype at the wrong power level. Here. He held out the note. Howard looked at the note. He looked at Tony. He looked at the lab. You've been gone for 40 seconds, Howard said. For you, Tony said. It's been longer. Howard stared at him. Tony looked at his father, brilliant, difficult, frequently absent, entirely convinced of his own vision, occasionally capable of something that looked like the shape of love if you were patient enough to wait for it, and thought about Albus Dumbledore and the architecture of good intentions and the gap between what you believed you were. More actions. AI chat. Your membership is the best value in AI. See why Claude Sonnet 4.